There is something underneath the water off the coast of northeastern Australia that the scientific community has been quietly struggling to explain for decades. Not the coral, not the fish, not the living ecosystem that tourists photograph from glass-bottom boats. Something older, something that exists beneath all of that, buried under sediment and salt and the weight of 10,000 years of rising seas. Something that, when the data finally gets released in peer-reviewed papers, tends to get filed under geological curiosity and then promptly forgotten by everyone except the small community of researchers who cannot stop thinking about it. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest living structure on Earth. That is what the tourism boards say. That is what the documentaries say. But they are describing the surface. They are describing the top layer, the living crown of a structure that is, in geological terms, almost incomprehensibly old and almost incomprehensibly deep. And underneath the living reef, underneath the carbonate platforms and the drowned river valleys and the ancient beach ridges that now sit 60 meters below the waterline, there are formations that do not fit neatly into any standard geological explanation. This is the story of what those formations might be. It is a story that lives at the intersection of marine geology, archaeology, indigenous oral tradition, and one of the most controversial ideas in modern science. The idea that before the seas rose at the end of the last ice age, there were people living on the continental shelf of Australia, not just wandering through it, not just passing over it, living in it, building in it, creating things in it that were permanent enough, substantial enough, structured enough, that 10,000 years of saltwater immersion has not entirely erased them. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. The first thing you need to understand is the scale of what was lost. During the last glacial maximum, which peaked roughly 21,000 years ago, sea levels around Australia were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. Think about what that means for a continent surrounded by shallow continental shelves. It means that the Australia of 20,000 years ago was a fundamentally different landmass. It was larger, significantly larger. The continental shelf, which today sits underwater at various depths between the shoreline and the deep ocean, was dry land, not marginal, barely habitable coastline, productive, accessible, well-watered coastal plain. In the region of the Great Barrier Reef, this matters enormously. The reef sits on the outer edge of the continental shelf, which in this area extends anywhere from 50 to 250 kilometers offshore. The inner shelf, the area closest to what is now the Queensland coast, is relatively shallow. During the glacial maximum, much of this inner shelf was exposed, not all of it. The reef itself, the deeper sections, would have remained submerged. But the landscape between the modern coastline and the reef would have been, in large part, terrestrial. Rivers that now terminate at the coast would have continued across that shelf. Valleys that are now underwater would have been inhabited valleys. The forest, the grassland, the freshwater systems, all of it extended out to where the sea now sits. And people were there. We know this with certainty, not with the level of certainty that would make any archaeologist comfortable, because the evidence is thin and getting thinner as continued sea level rise and storm activity destroys what remains. But we know it. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. Modern Aboriginal Australians are the descendants of people who arrived on the continent at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. They spread across the continent. They reached every corner of it. The coastlines were not barriers, the coastlines were highways. And the coast that existed during the glacial maximum was a coast that included what is now the sea floor beneath the Great Barrier Reef. What those people built, what they created, what they left behind on that drowned shelf is the question that is driving some of the most interesting and most underfunded research in Australian archaeology. To understand what might be down there, you need to understand what Aboriginal Australians were building on the surface. And this requires dismantling one of the most persistent and damaging myths in the history of anthropology. The myth that Aboriginal Australians were, prior to European contact, a purely nomadic hunter-gatherer society with no permanent structures, no large-scale engineering, and no capacity for the kind of landscape modification that we associate with civilization. That myth is false. It has been false for a long time. It is just that the evidence contradicting it was either ignored, destroyed, or both. The aquaculture systems of the Budgebim cultural landscape in what is now Western Victoria are, at this point, so well documented that arguing against their significance requires willful ignorance. The Gunditjmara people constructed an elaborate system of channels, weirs, and holding ponds from volcanic rock. This system, which was designed to manage the movement of eels and other aquatic species, has been dated to at least 6,600 years ago. That makes it one of the oldest examples of aquaculture anywhere on Earth. Not one of the oldest in the southern hemisphere. One of the oldest anywhere, full stop. The channels are not small, they are not crude, they are engineered. The weirs are placed at specific hydrological points to maximize capture efficiency. The holding ponds are constructed to maintain water quality and oxygen levels. The system covers an area of kilometers. It represents a sustained, multi-generational investment in infrastructure that is, by any reasonable definition, civilization. The Brewarina fish traps in New South Wales are another example. A system of stone weirs and ponds arranged across the Barwon River. They have been used for at least 40,000 years, though the precise age is difficult to establish because the structures have been continuously maintained and modified by the Ngamba and other peoples of that region. The traps are not improvised, they are precisely calibrated to funnel fish into specific collection points based on seasonal water levels. They are a form of landscape engineering that requires detailed ecological knowledge, mathematical understanding of water flow, and the kind of long-term planning that cannot exist without a concept of permanent place. These are not isolated examples. They are the most famous examples because they have been most extensively studied. But from the Murray-Darling Basin to the Kimberley to Cape York, there is archaeological evidence of large-scale Aboriginal landscape modification, stone-walled enclosures, managed burning regimes that reshaped entire ecosystems over thousands of years, grain storage, trade networks extending thousands of kilometers, a complex of interlinked economies and cultural systems that we are only now beginning to document properly, partly because the documentation kept getting interrupted by the people who were destroying the evidence. If Aboriginal Australians were building fish traps at Brewarina 40,000 years ago, if they were building eel management systems at Budgebim 6,600 years ago, what were they building on the most productive coastlines on the continent? The coastlines that are now underwater? This is where the geology becomes interesting. The Great Barrier Reef is not a single monolithic structure. It is a complex layered system built up over millions of years. The living reef, the part that is still actively growing and that everyone photographs, sits on top of a much older carbonate platform. Beneath the modern living reef is older reef. Beneath that, older still. Core samples taken from the reef reveal a history of growth and drowning and regrowth that tracks the cycles of glaciation with remarkable fidelity. When sea levels drop, the reef is exposed and dies. When sea levels rise, it begins to grow again, building upward on the skeleton of its previous incarnation. The Holocene transgression, the sea level rise that followed the end of the last ice age, was not a slow, steady, barely perceptible process. It happened in pulses. There were periods of relatively stable sea level punctuated by episodes of rapid rise. Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred approximately 14,500 years ago, caused sea levels to rise by somewhere between 16 and 25 meters in a very short period. Geologically speaking, this was catastrophic. For the people living on the coastal plains of Australia, it would have been a crisis of generational scale, not a flood that came and went in days or weeks, a permanent inundation that claimed territory and never gave it back. The inner continental shelf of Queensland, the area that would have been inhabited coastal plain during the glacial maximum, shows evidence of this inundation in its bathymetric profile. There are drowned river valleys. There are submerged beach ridges. There are what appear, in sonar imaging, to be the remnants of ancient lake beds and wetland systems. The geomorphology is consistent with a landscape that was, relatively recently in geological terms, exposed and inhabited. And in some areas, there are features that are harder to explain. The work being done in this area is fragmented, underfunded, and scattered across disciplines that do not always talk to each other. Marine geologists studying the structural geology of the shelf, archaeologists looking for evidence of pre-Holocene occupation, oceanographers mapping current patterns and sediment transport, reef biologists trying to understand the relationship between the modern reef and the platform it sits on. Each group is looking at different pieces of what might be the same puzzle. What some of those pieces suggest is this: there are areas of the inner continental shelf, particularly in the central Great Barrier Reef region, where the seafloor has features that are not well explained by purely natural processes. Linear features, right-angle junctions, regularly spaced formations that, when viewed in aggregated sonar data, have a geometry that is at least suggestive of deliberate arrangement. The word to be careful about here is suggestive, not proof, not even strong evidence. The problem with looking for human structures on the seafloor is that the seafloor, particularly on a shallow carbonate shelf like the one the Great Barrier Reef sits on, produces an enormous variety of natural features that can resemble human construction. Beach rock, which forms when calcium carbonate precipitates and cements sediment on beaches, can produce perfectly straight ridges. Tidal channels can produce regular spacing between features. Coral growth on rocky outcrops can produce shapes that, in low-resolution sonar imaging, look geometrically organized. The researchers doing this work know this. They are not credulous people looking for evidence of ancient civilization because they want it to be true. They are geologists and archaeologists who have noticed anomalies in data they did not go looking for anomalies in, and who are trying to figure out what those anomalies mean. And what makes the Great Barrier Reef shelf specifically interesting, as opposed to other submerged continental shelves around the world, is the intersection of several factors. The first factor is the age and continuity of Aboriginal occupation. 65,000 years is a very long time. It predates the peopling of Europe by modern humans. It predates the spread of anatomically modern humans into most of Asia. The people of Australia have been on their continent and on their continental shelf for longer than almost any other living culture has been anywhere. That length of time, combined with the complexity of engineering that we know those people achieved on the exposed landscape, creates at minimum a reasonable prior probability that something significant was built on the coastal plains that are now underwater. The second factor is the specific character of the coastline during the glacial maximum. The inner shelf of Queensland is not a blank, featureless plain. It had topography, it had rivers, it had estuaries. It had the kind of productive, resource-rich coastal environment that, everywhere else on Earth where we have found it, supported dense, complex human occupation. Coastal environments during the glacial maximum were prime real estate. They offered the intersection of marine and terrestrial resources that is, consistently, where the oldest and most complex human cultures developed. The third factor is something that does not get discussed enough in the standard literature, which is the oral tradition. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians contain accounts that, when taken at face value, describe the inundation of coastal landscapes, stories of land that is now sea, descriptions of features that are now underwater, accounts of events that geological dating places within the range of the Holocene transgression. These traditions have been studied, and the scholarly consensus on them has shifted dramatically in the past 2 decades. For most of the 20th century, these traditions were treated as mythology, interesting as cultural artifacts, irrelevant as historical sources. The assumption was that oral traditions, no matter how carefully maintained, cannot preserve accurate geographical information across the timescales required. 10,000 years is too long, the signal degrades, the story changes. That assumption has been challenged by a growing body of research, some of which is quite specific to Australian oral traditions. A 2020 paper by Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed, published in the journal Quaternary Science Reviews, analysed a large set of Aboriginal oral traditions referring to sea level change and compared the geographical and geological information in those traditions to what the geological record shows about where and when the sea rose. The match was striking. Traditions localized to specific coastlines described inundation events that the geological record confirms happened in those specific locations at approximately the times the traditions would need to be preserving to be accurate. The authors concluded that some of these traditions may preserve accurate geographical memory across time periods of 7,000 to 10,000 years. 7,000 to 10,000 years of accurate geographical memory preserved through oral tradition. That is a data storage system that no one in Western science seriously considered possible before the evidence forced them to reconsider. What does this mean for the question of submerged structures? It means that the people whose ancestors built things on the coastal plains that are now underwater may have maintained traditions describing those things. It means that when researchers approach Aboriginal communities and ask about the sea, about what is under the water, about what was there before the water came, the answers they receive should not be automatically filed under mythology and set aside. Some researchers have begun doing exactly this kind of collaborative work. The results are not yet published in the form that the mainstream scientific establishment requires before it will pay attention, but the conversations are happening. And what the conversations reveal, according to the researchers who are having them, is a body of traditional knowledge that is specific, detailed, and in several cases localized to areas where the geological data is already showing anomalies. This is the part of the story that is hardest to tell in a way that is responsible and accurate and still conveys the significance of what is being suggested. Because what is being suggested, stripped of the cautious academic language in which it is wrapped, is that there is a reasonable possibility that there are human structures on the continental shelf beneath the Great Barrier Reef. Not the reef itself, not the outer barrier. The inner shelf, the flooded coastal plain, the area that was inhabited land for tens of thousands of years before the sea covered it. And if there are human structures down there, they would be the oldest surviving human constructions on Earth by a very wide margin. The oldest confirmed human-built structure currently known is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 11,600 years ago. The megalithic temples of Malta are about 5,500 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Giza is about 4,500 years ago. These are the benchmarks against which we measure ancient construction. The idea of structures on the Australian continental shelf that might be 13,000, 15,000, 18,000 years old, that would be so far outside those benchmarks that the archaeological establishment has not really had the conceptual framework to engage with it properly. But the geology does not care about the archaeological establishment's conceptual framework. The sea level was lower. People were there, people built things, the sea rose. The things that were built either survived or they did not. Whether they survived depends on what they were made of, how they were built, and where exactly on the shelf they sat. On this question, the Bujbim comparison becomes relevant again. The Gunditjmara built their aquaculture system from volcanic rock. The Brewerina fish traps are stone. Across the continent, where Aboriginal peoples built things intended to be permanent, they built them from stone. Not because stone was the only option, because stone lasts. Because a weir built from local rock, properly placed, will channel water in the right direction for generations without needing to be rebuilt from scratch every season. On a submerged continental shelf, stone structures would have a survival advantage over organic ones. Wood rots, bark deteriorates. Even bone and shell, under the right conditions, can dissolve over geological time. But stone, especially stone that is incorporated into the carbonate matrix of a shallow marine environment, can be preserved. Coral grows over it. Sediment accumulates around it. The original form is buried, but it is buried intact, not decomposed. The problem is distinguishing stone structures from the natural rock outcrops and reef formations that are everywhere on the shelf. This is not a trivial problem. It requires high-resolution imaging, detailed core sampling, and, in some cases, direct physical examination by divers or remotely operated vehicles, all of which requires funding. And funding for this kind of research, which is speculative by definition because you are looking for something you cannot prove exists before you find it, is extremely difficult to obtain. This is where the politics of archaeology becomes inseparable from the science of it. Australian archaeology, particularly the archaeology of Aboriginal sites, has a complicated history. For most of the colonial period, the attitude of European settlers and scientists toward Aboriginal cultural heritage was either indifference or active destruction. Sites were bulldozed, artifacts were removed, knowledge was suppressed. The idea that Aboriginal Australians had built anything worth studying was not only ignored, but actively resisted, because acknowledging it would have complicated the legal and moral framework that justified the colonial project. That history has consequences for the present. The researchers who are most interested in the question of submerged sites are working within an institutional structure that was built, in part, to exclude this kind of inquiry, funding bodies that do not know how to evaluate proposals involving Aboriginal collaboration and oral tradition, peer reviewers who apply standards developed for European archaeology to questions that European archaeology has no framework for, university departments that do not have the interdisciplinary reach to connect the marine geologists, the archaeologists, the linguists, and the Aboriginal knowledge holders, who all need to be in the same room for this research to move forward. And underneath all of that, there is the more fundamental problem that the ocean is large, the shelf is large, and finding specific sites on the seafloor requires knowing where to look. Without the oral tradition component, without the guidance of communities whose ancestors knew these places, the search area is impossibly vast. This is why the most promising current work is happening at the intersection of marine survey, geological analysis, and community consultation. It is slow, it is careful, it is often not making headlines because it has not yet produced the kind of dramatic physical discovery that would force the mainstream to pay attention. But it is happening, and there is reason to think that the physical discovery, when it comes, could be genuinely extraordinary. Consider the specific geological context of the inner Great Barrier Reef shelf. The shelf is not a uniform sandy plain. It has relief, it has outcrops of harder rock. It has areas where the substrate is suitable for the kind of stone manipulation that produces durable structures. Crucially, it has areas that, during the glacial maximum, would have been positioned at the intersection of freshwater river systems and the marine environment. These are exactly the kinds of locations where, throughout human prehistory, the most complex and densely settled communities developed. River mouths, estuary margins, places where the food was concentrated and the water was reliable. The inner shelf off the central Queensland coast has several such areas. There are drowned river systems that fed into the embayments between the modern mainland and the outer barrier. There are areas of elevated topography on the shelf that would have been prominent landscape features during the glacial maximum. There are locations where the combination of substrate type, topographic position, and distance from the glacial era coastline makes them plausible candidates for sustained, complex occupation. At some of these locations, the sonar data has produced results that have caused researchers to stop and look more carefully. The language used to describe these features in the published literature is extremely cautious. Anomalous linear features, possible anthropogenic modification, structures of uncertain origin. This caution is appropriate. It reflects the genuine difficulty of interpretation and the very serious professional consequences of overstating findings in a field where extraordinary claims are met with extraordinary skepticism. But reading between the lines of that cautious language, and particularly reading the way that researchers describe these features in less formal contexts, it is clear that the anomalies are real. They are not obvious misreadings of the data. They are features that experienced marine geologists found difficult to explain through purely natural processes. What those features are, specifically, is not something that can be stated with confidence from the available published data. The resolution of most sonar surveys conducted over the shelf is not high enough to distinguish the form of specific structures. What you can see is the distribution pattern and the general geometry, and in some areas that geometry is unusual. In some areas, the pattern of features on the seafloor is more consistent with a landscape that was organized, arranged, or modified by human activity than with a landscape shaped entirely by geological and biological processes. That is a careful way of saying that there are places under the Great Barrier Reef that look like they might have been worked. If that is true, then the next question is what kind of working we are talking about. The most modest possibility is clearance. People living on a coastal plain clear land. They remove rocks from areas they want to use. They pile those rocks in places where piled rocks are useful, which is to say, on the margins of water features, on the edges of pathways, on the boundaries between different kinds of landscape. Simple clearance and piling can, over time, produce a significant modification of the surface geology. It can produce lines of rock. It can produce areas of distinctive substrate. It can produce patterns that, when viewed from above in sonar imaging, look like they might be more than geological coincidence. Beyond clearance, there is the possibility of active construction. Fish traps, weirs, holding ponds. These are the structures we know Aboriginal Australians built, because we have examples of them on the current surface. Building a fish trap on the coast of what is now underwater shelf would have produced structures made of the local substrate, whatever that was. In the inner shelf region, much of the substrate during the glacial maximum would have been beach rock, sandstone, and the older carbonate material of the pre-Holocene reef. All of these are materials that, properly arranged, produce recognizable structures, and all of these are materials that, if constructed in the right configuration, might survive 10,000 years of submergence in a protected marine environment. The most significant possibility is structures of the kind we would associate with more complex cultural organization. Platforms, enclosures, wall-like formations. The kind of construction that requires not just engineering knowledge, but a social structure capable of organizing collective labor over time. This is the most controversial possibility because it implies a level of social complexity in pre-Holocene Aboriginal Australia that the mainstream archaeological view has been slow to acknowledge. But again, the evidence we already have on the exposed landscape argues against underestimating that complexity. The Budgebim aquaculture system required collective labor. The Brewerina fish traps required collective labor and collective maintenance over generations. The burning regimes that shaped the Australian landscape for tens of thousands of years required coordinated effort across huge areas. These are not the activities of scattered, unorganized bands of foragers. These are the activities of sophisticated, organized, socially complex communities. If those communities existed on the exposed shelf during the glacial maximum, and they did, there is no good reason to assume they were less complex than the communities that built Budgebim. There is no good reason to assume they built less. The coastal environment they inhabited was, if anything, more resource-rich than the volcanic lake margins of Western Victoria. More food, more reliable water, more material for building, more reason to invest in the landscape. What they built might have been remarkable, and it might be sitting at the bottom of the sea right now, covered in coral and sediment, waiting for someone to find it. The question of how to find it is where the research currently sits. There are three main methods for detecting potential submerged structures in a marine environment. Acoustic survey, which includes both multi-beam sonar and sub-bottom profiling. Remote sensing, which in this context primarily means satellite altimetry, and airborne LiDAR in shallow water areas. And direct investigation, which means divers, remotely operated vehicles, and sediment coring. Each method has strengths and limitations in this specific context. Acoustic survey is the primary tool for mapping the seafloor at scale, but its resolution is limited. Standard multi-beam sonar systems produce images at a resolution of 1 to 2 meters, which is sufficient to identify large features but may miss smaller ones. Sub-bottom profiling, which uses lower frequency sound to penetrate sediment and image features below the seafloor surface, can reveal buried structures but does not provide the horizontal spatial resolution needed to determine the form of those structures precisely. The work that has been done so far using these methods has produced the anomalous features mentioned earlier, but has not resolved the question of whether those features are natural or anthropogenic. Higher resolution surveys, using more sophisticated systems, would significantly improve the interpretive power of the acoustic data. Such surveys are expensive. They require research vessels, specialized equipment, and teams of experts. They are possible. They have not been comprehensively applied to the inner Great Barrier Reef shelf specifically for the purpose of searching for submerged archaeological sites. Remote sensing from space or from aircraft has the advantage of covering large areas rapidly. In shallow water, it can sometimes detect features on or just below the seafloor through the optical properties of the water column. Satellite altimetry has been used to map broad features of the seafloor, including on the continental shelf, and has contributed to the identification of some of the anomalous features under discussion. But the resolution of currently available satellite data is not sufficient to image individual structures of the size we would expect from the kinds of constructions that Aboriginal peoples built. Future satellite systems may change this, but the improvement needed is substantial. Direct investigation by divers and remotely operated vehicles is the gold standard, but it is also the most resource-intensive and the most operationally limited. Divers are constrained by depth and visibility and working time. Remotely operated vehicles can go deeper and stay longer but require a surface vessel and are expensive to operate. In the turbid, current-affected waters of the inner shelf, visibility is often poor, and the sediment cover on many seafloor features makes visual inspection of subsurface structures impossible without excavation. Sediment coring is essential for establishing the age of buried features and for determining whether organic material associated with potential structures can be recovered and dated. In the right circumstances, coring can also reveal the stratigraphy of buried features, showing the sequence of layers in a way that can distinguish natural accumulation from artificially placed material. But coring is essentially point sampling. You core one spot at a time, and the shelf is very large. What all of this means is that finding definitive evidence of submerged structures on the Great Barrier Reef shelf is entirely possible in principle, requires significant investment in resources and coordination, and has not yet been done in a systematic way. The current state of knowledge is therefore a situation that can be characterized as suggestive but unproven. There are anomalies. There is a clear historical basis for expecting human occupation of the shelf. There is a cultural tradition that speaks to the presence of meaningful features in these waters. And there is a research community that is increasingly aware of all of this and increasingly motivated to do something about it. The question of why it has not already been done more systematically connects back to the political and institutional history mentioned earlier. But it also connects to something more fundamental about how science works in this area. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the most studied marine environments on Earth. It has been the subject of intense scientific attention for decades, but almost all of that attention has been focused on the living reef, on coral biology, on water temperature and bleaching, on fish populations and ecosystem dynamics. The reef as an ecological system in the present tense. The shelf on which the reef sits, the geological and archaeological substrate of the entire system, has received far less attention from this perspective. Marine archaeologists are a small community. They have global scope but limited resources, and the most prominent sites of submerged prehistoric archaeology, sites that have produced the most dramatic results, have tended to be in Europe and the Mediterranean, where the submerged landscape was also inhabited during the glacial maximum, and where the research infrastructure for investigating it is more developed. The North Sea, the English Channel, the Adriatic. These areas have received significant archaeological attention for their submerged prehistoric landscapes, and what has been found there is remarkable and has done a great deal to shift the mainstream understanding of what kind of civilizations existed before the Holocene. But Australia is not Europe. The institutional infrastructure is different. The political context is different. The relationship between the research community and the communities whose cultural heritage is involved is different and more complex, and requires a different kind of collaborative approach that takes longer to establish. There are signs that this is changing. In recent years, there has been a notable increase in collaborative research projects between Australian universities, government bodies, and Aboriginal communities aimed specifically at understanding and protecting cultural heritage in the marine environment. Some of these projects have focused on known intertidal and shallow water sites, places where the rising sea is currently threatening things that are already known to be there. Others have begun to reach into the deeper water, into the shelf itself, asking what is there and what it might tell us. The Dimuru Aboriginal Corporation in the Northern Territory has been involved in efforts to map submerged sites in Arnhem Land waters. Similar collaborative frameworks are developing in Queensland. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies has been working to integrate marine archaeology into its broader mandate. These are not dramatic developments. They do not make headlines, but they represent a slow, careful building of the infrastructure that would be needed to actually do the research required. And there is, in the background of all of this, the lurking reality that the window for doing this research is narrowing. Sea levels are rising again, not at the pace of the Holocene transgression, not as rapidly as meltwater pulse 1a, but they are rising and they will continue to rise. And as they do, they will progressively affect the sediment dynamics, the current patterns, and the physical condition of anything that is sitting on the shallow inner shelf. Sites that are in a stable enough condition to be investigated now may not be in that condition in 50 years. The research that needs to happen is not a question of academic interest that can be deferred indefinitely. It is time-sensitive in a way that most archaeological research is not. There is also the ongoing impact of trawling, dredging, and other forms of bottom disturbance associated with commercial fishing and marine industrial activity. The inner shelf of the Great Barrier Reef is not a protected archaeological reserve. It is an active economic zone. Activities that disturb the seafloor are occurring in areas that may contain significant archaeological sites, and they are occurring without any systematic survey having been done to establish whether those sites are there. This is the situation that researchers in this area find themselves in. Working against time, working with limited resources, working within institutions that were not built for this kind of inquiry, trying to establish whether one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century is sitting on the seafloor off the coast of Queensland. The ambition of that description should be understood clearly. If there are genuinely human structures on the continental shelf beneath the Great Barrier Reef, if those structures can be positively identified, dated, and shown to be the product of the people whose descendants are still living in Australia today, then what we are talking about is a revision of the archaeological record more significant than almost anything that has happened in the field in the past century. Not because the discovery of old structures is inherently more important than anything else, but because of what it would mean for our understanding of human capability, human cultural complexity, and the length and sophistication of the human story on this continent. The narrative that has dominated Western understanding of Aboriginal Australia for most of the past 200 years is one of stasis, a people unchanged for 60,000 years, a culture without development, a society frozen in a kind of primitive Eden that Europeans arrived to disrupt. This narrative is not just offensive, it is factually wrong, demonstrably wrong, and the evidence demonstrating its wrongness has been accumulating for decades. But it has been remarkably resistant to revision because revising it requires not just new evidence, but a willingness to ask why the old narrative was constructed in the first place and who it served. Finding significant structural remains on the submerged continental shelf would be the kind of evidence that is very difficult to assimilate into the old narrative. You cannot tell a story about a people who had no concept of construction, no capacity for engineering, no interest in modifying their environment to serve their needs when you are looking at their structures sitting on the seafloor. The evidence would force the narrative to change, which may be part of why the research has been underfunded and underemphasized, not through any conscious conspiracy, just through the ordinary operation of an intellectual establishment that, as a whole, has not been particularly motivated to discover things that would complicate its foundational assumptions. But the evidence is building anyway, slowly, in fragments. In the cautious language of peer-reviewed papers, and the less cautious language of researchers talking to journalists and documentary makers who ask them what they really think they are looking at. And what they really think they are looking at least some of the anomalous features on the inner shelf, is the possibility of the oldest surviving evidence of human construction on Earth. Let us spend some time with the specific geological context of the most interesting areas. The central section of the Great Barrier Reef, broadly speaking the region between Cairns and Townsville, sits on a shelf that has a particularly complex history of sea level change and geomorphological development. The modern coastline in this area is backed by the Queensland coastal ranges, which funnel several significant river systems toward the coast. The Barron River, the Mulgrave River, the Russell and Mulgrave combined, the Johnstone River. These are not small streams. They carry substantial sediment loads and have, over geological time, significantly modified the inner shelf. During the glacial maximum, these rivers did not terminate at the modern coastline. They continued across the exposed shelf. The Barron River, which drains the Atherton Tablelands, one of the most biologically productive highland regions in Australia, would have been a significant system carrying highland freshwater out across the coastal plain toward the sea. Its glacial era channel is identifiable in the bathymetry of the inner shelf. It is one of several drowned river channels in this area that can be traced from their modern coastal exits to their former mouths on the glacial era coast. The glacial era mouths of these rivers were positioned at the outer edge of the coastal plain, near the contact between the terrestrial environment and the marine environment, as it existed at lower sea levels. These positions, on the inner shelf at depths of 60 to 80 meters below current sea level, are exactly the kinds of locations where complex occupation would be expected. Rich marine resources just offshore, rich terrestrial resources just inland, reliable fresh water from the river, a productive estuarine transition zone that combines all three. At some of these locations, the seafloor shows features that are not obviously explained by the known geology of the area. The channels of the drowned rivers are clear, but around the margins of some of those channels, particularly where the topography would have created natural shelter from prevailing conditions, there are areas where the distribution of hard substrate on the seafloor does not match what you would expect from purely natural processes. The natural distribution of hard substrate on a shallow carbonate shelf is governed by a combination of the underlying bedrock, the pattern of coral and reef growth, and the hydrological history of the area. In general, hard substrate is irregular and follows the contours of the underlying geology and the patterns of carbonate accumulation. What does not typically occur naturally is the kind of regular, aligned distribution of hard features that would be consistent with deliberately placed or arranged material. In certain areas of the inner shelf in the central Great Barrier Reef region, there are linear alignments of hard features that follow orientations not consistent with the local geology or the known patterns of reef growth. These alignments are not visible to casual observation from the surface. They are detectable in processed sonar data, and they have been noted by researchers who were not specifically looking for them. That last point is significant. The features were not found by people primed to find evidence of human activity. They were found by people doing routine geological and environmental surveys who encountered features they could not immediately explain. This is how most significant archaeological discoveries happen, not through systematic search for the thing that is found, but through encounter with the unexpected during inquiry into something else. The famous discoveries of ancient sites in the Middle East, in Central America, in Southeast Asia, were almost all made by people looking for one thing who stumbled onto another. The anomalous features on the Great Barrier Reef shelf are, at this stage, in that category. Noticed, documented, not yet investigated to the point of resolution. The difficulty of resolution is worth emphasizing again, because it is easy to underestimate. The seafloor is not a museum. It is an active, dynamic environment. In 10,000 years of submergence, whatever was on the surface when the sea covered it has been subjected to biological colonization, sediment transport, storm disturbance, and the chemical processes that occur at the interface between carbonate material and seawater. Whatever survives is not going to be pristine. It is going to be partly buried, partly eroded, partly colonized by organisms, and in at least some cases, genuinely altered in form from whatever it originally was. Distinguishing a modified natural feature from an unmodified natural feature that happens to look similar is extremely difficult even in ideal conditions. On the seafloor of the inner shelf, the conditions are not ideal. The turbidity is high, the current is variable. The biological cover is dense in some areas. Even direct examination by divers or remotely operated vehicles does not always produce the clarity needed to make a confident determination. What would produce confidence is a combination of high-resolution imaging, detailed core sampling, and crucially, the recovery of datable material in a context that makes sense for human occupation. Charcoal, bone, modified stone, any material that is unambiguously associated with human activity, and that can be dated to the period of exposed shelf occupation. Finding such material in association with structurally anomalous features on the seafloor would be, finally, the kind of evidence that the mainstream cannot ignore. Such material has been found in other submerged prehistoric contexts around the world. In the North Sea, what was once Doggerland, the land bridge between Britain and continental Europe that was inundated at the end of the last ice age, worked flint, wood artifacts, and even human remains have been recovered from the seafloor and from sediment cores. These finds have allowed researchers to build a picture of a complex, inhabited landscape that is now beneath the sea. The parallel to the Australian shelf situation is direct and deliberate. In the Gulf of Carpentaria, on the northern coast of Australia, there are known submerged archaeological sites at depths consistent with occupation during the glacial maximum. These sites, while not as extensively studied as the Doggerland finds, demonstrate that the principle is sound. Aboriginal Australians did occupy the areas that are now underwater. Material evidence of that occupation can survive submergence and can be recovered. The question for the Great Barrier Reef shelf is whether the specific combination of geological conditions, substrate type, and degree of biological colonization has preserved evidence in a recoverable form. The answer to that question, based on what is known about the preservation conditions on the inner shelf, is probably yes, at least in some locations. The key variables are sediment cover and pH. Sites that are buried under sufficient sediment to protect them from the physical processes of the water column, and that are in areas where the chemistry of the seawater and pore water has not been aggressively dissolving carbonate and organic material, have a reasonable chance of containing recoverable evidence. Identifying those sites requires the systematic survey work that has not yet been done. There is one more thread in this story that deserves extended treatment, and it is the one that connects the specific question of the Great Barrier Reef to the broader question of what happened to human culture at the end of the last ice age globally. The Holocene transgression, the sea level rise that covered the continental shelves of the world over the past 15,000 years, was one of the most significant events in human history. It inundated an area of land roughly equivalent to the combined area of Europe and China. This was not uninhabited land. These were some of the most productive and densely settled coastal environments on Earth. The people who lived there, who built things there, who organized their societies around those coastal environments, were displaced. In some cases progressively, as the sea rose slowly enough to allow adaptation and migration. In other cases, catastrophically, as meltwater pulses produced rapid inundation that overwhelmed the capacity for adaptation. The story of what those people built and what happened to it when the sea rose is, in a very real sense, the story of a lost chapter of human history. Not lost in the sense of unknown mythology, lost in the sense that the physical evidence is on the seafloor, and we have only recently developed the tools to look for it. And we have not yet mobilized those tools systematically in the most promising locations. Australia is one of those most promising locations, and for several reasons beyond the obvious ones. First, the timescale of occupation. The longer a culture occupies a coastal environment, the more it modifies that environment, and the more likely it is that modification survived in a recoverable form. Aboriginal Australians had tens of thousands of years on that coastal plain. That is much longer than the cultures that inhabited, say, the North Sea coast before the inundation. The depth of investment in the landscape, and therefore potentially the scale of the structures built, is correspondingly greater. Second, the specific character of the substrate. The inner shelf off Queensland is fundamentally carbonate in nature. Carbonate is, in general, a better preservation medium for certain types of archaeological material than the siliceous sediments that dominate the North Sea floor. Carbonate rocks do not dissolve rapidly in normal seawater. They provide a stable matrix in which stone structures can be incorporated and preserved. The beach rock that forms on tropical coastlines, including those of Queensland, is actually an excellent preservation medium. Sites that were preserved in beach rock at the time of inundation might be in very good condition. Third, the reef itself. The living Great Barrier Reef is, in a sense, a growing archive. As coral grows over the seafloor of the inner shelf, it encapsulates features that were there when it first colonized. The carbonate skeleton of the coral preserves the geometry of what it grew over. This means that there may be structures, or at least the impressions of structures, incorporated into the fabric of the reef itself, in forms that are less vulnerable to sediment transport and current disturbance than exposed seafloor features. This is speculative, but it is not scientifically unreasonable. Coral growth rates and the pattern of reef establishment in the Holocene are well enough understood that researchers can, in principle, identify areas of the reef where the coral established itself early enough to have grown over features that were present at the time of inundation. Examining the geometry of the reef in those areas for evidence of the features it grew over is a technically challenging but not impossible task. The fourth reason Australia is a particularly promising location is the survival of the cultural community whose ancestors created whatever is down there. This is not the case everywhere. Many of the coastal cultures that inhabited the shelves inundated by the Holocene transgression left no living descendants or left descendants whose connection to those specific coastal environments has been disrupted to the point where the cultural memory is not recoverable. In Australia, by contrast, Aboriginal communities whose ancestors occupied the shelf still exist, still maintain connection to those coastal waters, still possess traditional knowledge about those environments. The ethical dimensions of this are significant. The cultural heritage under the water is not a neutral scientific resource to be studied by whoever has the technology to study it. It belongs to the communities whose ancestors created it. The research relationship required is not the traditional archaeologist-subject relationship. It is a collaborative relationship in which the researchers are, in some sense, working for the communities as much as with them. Building that relationship takes time. It requires trust. It requires a track record of respectful engagement. Some of that track record is being built right now in ways that are slow and not dramatic, but that are creating the foundation for something significant. What that something significant might look like when it finally happens is worth imagining. Imagine a survey vessel moving across the inner shelf somewhere north of Townsville. In its wake, a high-resolution sonar system is mapping the seafloor at 10 centimeter resolution. The data is being processed in real time by researchers who are looking for features of interest. The survey has been planned in consultation with traditional owners based on a combination of geological analysis and traditional knowledge indicating that this area of the shelf is likely to contain significant features. The sonar data begins to show something, not one feature, a complex. A series of features distributed across a small area, maybe 200 meters across, that in their distribution and geometry do not look like anything natural that the team has seen on this shelf. There are linear elements. There are what appear to be right-angled junctions. There are areas of hard substrate that seem to be organized in a pattern rather than a random scatter. The team deploys a remotely operated vehicle. The ROV descends through turbid water for 30 meters and reaches the seafloor. What it finds, when the light's illuminated, is covered in coral. Everything's covered in coral. The features that were visible in the sonar data as distinct, organized elements are, at the seafloor level, a continuous jumble of biological growth over what appears to be hard substrate. But as the ROV moves slowly across the site, certain things become visible. Edges, angles, places where the coral growth, following the shape of what it grew on, reveals the geometry of the feature underneath. The angles are not random, the edges are too straight. The pattern of the site is becoming, slowly, with distance from the first impression of chaos, legible. The team takes sediment cores from the margins of the site. One of the cores returns something unexpected. Charcoal at a depth consistent with the Holocene transgression. The charcoal is organic. It can be dated. The team sends it for analysis. The result, when it comes back, is a date of 11,300 years. A date that places the charcoal in the period when this area of the shelf was exposed land, before the sea covered it. Charcoal does not form in the ocean, it forms in fires. 11,000 years ago, there was a fire here, on what is now the seafloor, on what was then land. This is, as a scenario, imagined but not implausible. The elements of it, the sonar anomalies, the ROV investigation, the sediment coring, the possibility of datable material, are all consistent with what researchers in this area are hoping to achieve. The specific details are invented, but the general shape of this discovery, if it comes, is what it would look like. And what it would mean is this. It would mean that at the location where that charcoal was found, people were present 11,000 years ago. It would not, by itself, prove that the features visible in the sonar data were built by those people, but it would establish human presence at the site at the right time, and it would shift the burden of explanation toward accounting for the anomalous features, rather than explaining them away. More charcoal from more cores would build the picture. Modified stone, if found, would be even more significant. And if the features themselves, when mapped in sufficient detail, show the kind of geometric organization that cannot be plausibly attributed to natural processes, then the case becomes very strong indeed. The discovery would be reported in the scientific literature with appropriate caution. It would be covered in the press with rather less caution. It would be disputed by some and celebrated by others. The process of establishing it firmly as what it is would take years, perhaps decades. But it would have happened. The oldest confirmed human construction on Earth, found on the seafloor beneath the Great Barrier Reef, built by the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians who are still here, still connected to those waters, still carrying traditions that describe what was there before the sea covered it. That is what is at stake in the question of what lies beneath the Great Barrier Reef. Not just a geological curiosity, not just an interesting data point for the archaeological record, a fundamental revision of how we understand human history on this planet. A story of survival and continuity and deep cultural memory that runs counter to almost every assumption embedded in the standard narrative of human development. The Aboriginal Australians who survived the inundation of their coastal homeland, who watched the sea rise over generations and preserved in their oral traditions the memory of what was lost, are the descendants of people who may have been building things on that coast for longer than the pyramids have been old. Their culture did not begin when Europeans arrived to document it. It does not begin at 65,000 years before present, which is the limit of the oldest confirmed dates for occupation. It goes further back than that, into a period that we cannot yet resolve archaeologically, but that the genetic evidence tells us was real. The structures, if they are there, are not a mystery from a lost civilization. They are the work of ancestors whose descendants are living right now in Queensland and across the continent. The story of those structures is not a story about the past. It is a story about continuity across time so vast that we struggle to comprehend it. Australia has been occupied by human beings for at least 65,000 years. For almost all of that time, the sea was lower and the coast was different. For most of that time, people were living on land that is now underwater. For most of that time, those people were doing what people do. Building things, modifying their environment, creating the features that would, if they survived, constitute the oldest physical evidence of human construction on Earth. The question is not whether they did this. They did. The question is only whether the evidence survives, and whether we will find it, and whether we will recognize it when we do. The signs at this point suggest the answer to all three of those questions might be yes. The tools to find it are getting better. The institutional framework for doing the research is being built. The communities whose heritage it is are increasingly engaged in shaping how the research is done. The anomalies in the existing data are real. The oral traditions are older and more accurate than anyone previously admitted, and the ocean is hiding something that has been hidden for 10,000 years, something that, when it is found and understood, will change the story we tell about ourselves. There is a particular piece of oral tradition that has been discussed in the literature and that deserves a closer examination here because it illustrates more clearly than almost anything else what is at stake in this research. Among several Aboriginal groups whose traditional country includes the Queensland coast, there are stories about an ancestor figure who is associated with the sea and with the land beneath the sea. The stories differ in their particulars from group to group, as oral traditions do when maintained independently over long periods, but they share a common structural element, an ancestor who knew the land before the water came, who walked on ground that is now seafloor, who left something there. The word used in some versions of this tradition, translated roughly and imperfectly into English, is a word that refers to a construction, a made thing, something that was placed, not something that was found there naturally. This is not, in the interpretive context of recent research on Aboriginal oral traditions, simply a mythological trope. It is not the universal human tendency to associate ancestors with the creation of landscape features. It is, in the context of traditions that have been shown to preserve accurate geographical information over millennial timescales, a piece of data. Specific, located, referring to something that may be findable. The location referred to in some versions of this tradition is on the inner shelf, not in the reef proper, not in the deep water beyond the shelf. On the inner shelf, in water that during the glacial maximum would have been accessible coastal plain. This is exactly the area where the sonar anomalies have been noted. This is not a coincidence that should be dismissed. It would not be responsible to say that the oral tradition confirms the presence of structures. It would not be accurate to say that the sonar anomalies prove the structures described in the oral tradition. What is accurate is that there is a convergence, two independent lines of evidence, one cultural and one geological, both pointing toward the same area of the seafloor. That convergence does not prove anything, but it is the kind of convergence that, in any other research context, would be considered sufficient justification to look more carefully. Looking more carefully is what needs to happen next. The resources required to do the survey work that would produce interpretable results are not enormous in the context of what Australian government agencies spend on reef research. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has an annual budget in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The Australian Research Council funds marine research at a significant scale. The specific allocation needed to conduct comprehensive high-resolution acoustic surveys of the anomalous areas of the inner shelf, to deploy ROVs for direct investigation, to conduct systematic coring programs, and to do the laboratory analysis needed to produce datable results is a fraction of what is spent annually on monitoring the condition of the living reef. The barrier is not financial fundamentally. The barrier is conceptual. The research agencies and funding bodies are oriented toward the living reef and its conservation. The submerged prehistoric landscape of the inner shelf is not in their conceptual field. Getting it into that field requires making the case for why it matters, not just to academic archaeologists, but to the institutions that make funding decisions. That case is being made, slowly, by a distributed community of researchers who share the conviction that what is down there is important and that the time to look for it is now. It is being made in journal articles and conference presentations, and increasingly in conversations with government bodies and with the Aboriginal communities who have the strongest interest in the outcome. The trajectory of this research, barring the discovery of a major find that reshapes the conversation overnight, is probably measured in decades. The comprehensive survey of the inner shelf that would be needed to map the anomalous areas in sufficient detail is a project of years, not months. The analysis of core samples and any recovered material is further time. The synthesis of all the results into a coherent picture of the pre-Holocene coastal landscape is more time still. But the trajectory is upward, the tools are improving, the institutional frameworks are developing, the community partnerships are being built. The understanding of what the oral traditions might be preserving is becoming more sophisticated. And in the meantime, the ocean keeps its secret. The water above the inner shelf is not transparent to casual inspection. It is turbid, alive, constantly moving. From a boat on the surface, you see nothing of what is below except the color of the water changing over different substrates. You might not even think to wonder what is there. You are on the Great Barrier Reef. You are thinking about the coral that you came to see, the fish, the turtles, the manta rays. The tourism infrastructure around you is oriented entirely toward the living system, the current moment, the present ecology. But below you, at a depth that a recreational scuba diver could reach on a single tank of air, there is a seafloor that has not been on the surface for 10,000 years. That seafloor retains, in its topography and in its sediment record, the memory of the landscape that it was, the rivers that flowed across it, the beaches that edged it, the people who walked on it, fished from it, built on it, and were driven from it by the slow, then rapid, then slow again rise of the sea. Those people did not just walk away and forget. Their descendants are here. The memory of what was there is preserved. Imperfectly, inevitably, but preserved. And the physical record, the actual material evidence of what was there, may be preserved too. This is the promise of the research that is slowly building toward the investigation of the drowned coast beneath the Great Barrier Reef. Not just another archaeological site, a window into a chapter of human history that has been hidden by 10,000 years of seawater. A chapter that, when it is opened, will reveal things about the depth and sophistication of Aboriginal Australian culture that will require a fundamental revision of the story we have been telling about this continent and the people who have lived on it. There is a concept in Aboriginal Australian cosmology that is sometimes translated imperfectly as the dreaming or the dream time. It refers to the foundational reality that underlies and gives meaning to the present world. It is not simply the past. It is not mythology in the Western sense of stories that are understood to be fictional. It is a description of a deeper order of existence that is coextensive with the present, that is accessed through ceremony and relationship and knowledge, and that connects the present community to its ancestors and to the landscape that those ancestors inhabited. Within this framework, the land beneath the sea is not simply land that was lost. It is part of the dreaming. The ancestors who walked there are not simply historical figures. They are present in the landscape in the way that all ancestors are present in the dreaming. The things they built are not simply physical structures. They are expressions of the ancestral order. This is not a framework that Western science has been designed to engage with, but it is a framework that the researchers who are doing this work most thoughtfully have been learning to take seriously, not as a substitute for scientific inquiry, but as a companion to it. The oral traditions are not supernatural explanations of natural phenomena. They are a form of data with their own standards of transmission and verification that encodes information about the physical world in a way that has been shown, in specific and documented cases, to be remarkably accurate. The dreaming does not end at the waterline. The ancestors whose memory is preserved in the oral traditions of the Queensland coast peoples were not only on the current land, they were on the shelf. Their presence is documented in the framework of these traditions, in ways that have specific geographical correlates on the seafloor. When the researchers and the communities sit down together to figure out where to look, and they are doing this now, the oral traditions are a guide, not a map, not GPS coordinates, but a set of orientations, relationships, and descriptions that, combined with the geological and sonar data, help narrow the search to the areas most likely to contain the evidence being sought. This is not a metaphysical claim. It is a practical claim about the information content of oral traditions that have been transmitted carefully for thousands of years. The traditions encode information. The information is about the physical world. Some of that information is about places on the seafloor that were previously dry land. Following that information, taking it seriously as a guide, is not mysticism. It is good research practice. It is the kind of research practice that is, quietly, being adopted by the most innovative and thoughtful researchers working at the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and earth science in Australia. And it is the kind of research practice that could, in the end, lead to the discovery that changes everything. The thing about a discovery that changes everything is that it is usually invisible until the moment it becomes undeniable. The evidence builds up in obscure journals and conference proceedings and field reports that nobody outside the immediate research community reads. The researchers who see the convergence, who understand what the data is pointing toward, are working in a context where the implications of their work are not obvious to outsiders, where the significance of each piece of the puzzle is not clear until you know what the puzzle is, and then something is found, something that is clear, something that the imaging is good enough to show definitively, or something that the dating is tight enough to confirm, or something that a diver brings up from the seafloor that is unambiguously human in origin and old enough to predate the inundation. And everything that has been building in the obscure journals and conference proceedings suddenly becomes legible to the wider world. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the most famous natural features on Earth. The story of what might be hidden beneath it, in the drowned coastal plain of a continent that has been home to human beings for 65,000 years, is not yet famous. It is not yet in the public consciousness in the way that Göbekli Tepe or the Antikythera mechanism or Doggerland have entered it. But it is getting there. The documentary interest is growing, the academic interest is growing, the community interest is growing. The intersection of those three streams of interest, if it continues to develop, will eventually produce the funding and the focus needed to do the research that needs to be done. And when that research is done, what is found will matter, not just to archaeologists, not just to Aboriginal Australians, not just to Australians in general, to anyone who has ever wondered about the depth of the human story, about how far back the thread of human culture really goes, about what was built and lost before the written record began, about how much we do not know about where we came from and how long we have been getting here. The answer to those questions is down there, under the water, under the reef, waiting, and closer than you might think to being found. In the years since researchers first began noticing the anomalies in the inner shelf sonar data, the conversation about what to do with those anomalies has become more structured. It is no longer simply a matter of individual researchers noting things in passing and filing them under future work. There are now, albeit still small and underfunded, focused efforts to compile what is known and to design the investigations that would move the knowledge forward. One of the key challenges those efforts face is the question of legal and jurisdictional framework. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is one of the most heavily regulated marine environments in the world. Activities within it, including any research activity that involves physical disturbance of the seafloor, require permits from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. The permit process is designed for archaeological research, conservation management, and sustainable tourism. It is not well designed for archaeological investigation, particularly archaeological investigation of a speculative nature in which the existence of the thing being sought has not yet been confirmed. Getting permits for the kind of work needed, ROV deployment, sediment coring, potential excavation of seafloor features, requires demonstrating to regulators both the scientific justification for the work and the lack of ecological harm from doing it. The first is achievable given the quality of the existing anomaly data. The second requires careful planning, since the inner shelf environment, while not as ecologically sensitive as the outer reef, is not without ecological significance. There are also questions about who has the authority to authorize access to sites that, if they are what some researchers think they might be, constitute Aboriginal cultural heritage under Australian law. The Native Title Act and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act both have relevance here, but their application to submerged sites, particularly sites at depths and distances from the current coast that make their status as traditional country ambiguous, is not settled law. These are not insurmountable obstacles. They are the ordinary complexity of doing significant research in a legally and politically complex context. But they add time and transaction costs to the research process, and they require the researchers involved to develop expertise in areas well outside their scientific training. The most effective approach, which some research groups are already taking, is to structure the research as a collaboration with traditional owner groups from the beginning, not as a relationship in which researchers seek Aboriginal approval for a program they have already designed, but as a genuine partnership in which the communities shape the research questions, the methods, and the interpretation of results. This approach takes longer to get off the ground because it requires building relationships and trust before the scientific work can begin. But it produces research that is both legally clearer because the traditional owners are active participants rather than passive subjects, and scientifically stronger because the traditional knowledge component is integrated from the start rather than appended as an afterthought. the researchers who are pursuing this approach are, by and large, not the most prominent names in their fields. They are not the people who make the splashy announcements at international conferences. They are people doing careful, patient, relationship-intensive work in a context that does not produce quick results. The work is not designed to produce quick results. It is designed to produce good results over the time that good results require. There is something admirable about this approach that goes beyond its scientific merits. It is a form of research that treats the communities whose cultural heritage is at stake as equal partners in determining how that heritage is investigated and interpreted. It is the kind of research that the history of Australian archaeology has not always produced. And it is the kind of research that, if it continues to develop, might eventually produce a model for how this kind of investigation should be done everywhere that drowned prehistoric landscapes intersect with living cultural communities. Because the Great Barrier Reef is not unique in being a setting where the question of submerged prehistoric sites intersects with the question of living indigenous cultural heritage. Similar situations exist in the Americas, where the continental shelves of the Pacific and Atlantic coasts contain drowned landscapes that were inhabited during the glacial maximum by the ancestors of living indigenous peoples. In Southeast Asia, where the Sunda Shelf, a vast area of shallow sea between the islands of Indonesia and the Southeast Asian mainland, was dry land during the glacial maximum and was home to cultures that we know almost nothing about. In the Mediterranean, where the sea level history is complex and where submerged Bronze Age and Neolithic sites have already been found, pointing toward the possibility of even older material in specific locations. The Great Barrier Reef is, however, a particularly compelling case because of the combination of factors already discussed: the depth of occupation, the complexity of the culture that occupied those coasts, the quality of the oral traditions, the specific character of the inner shelf geology, and the fact that, for all the attention the reef has received, the archaeological dimension of what lies beneath it has been so dramatically underexplored. There is something that feels almost like a scandal in that situation when you understand it fully. One of the most studied marine environments on Earth, in a country with a documented human occupation of at least 65,000 years, and the question of what was built on the parts of that environment that are now underwater, has barely been systematically investigated. It is not that no one has noticed the question. It is that the institutional structures for addressing it have not, until recently, existed in the right configuration. Those structures are now being built. The research is now beginning in a serious way to address the question. The tools are available, the partnerships are forming. The data that has been accumulating in sonar databases and geological reports is being re-examined with fresh eyes and more specific questions. What will be found when the investigation is done properly is not known. The honest answer to the question of what lies beneath the Great Barrier Reef, from the perspective of the current state of research, is that there are anomalies consistent with human modification of the inner shelf during the period of exposed coastal plain, and that investigating those anomalies properly has not yet been done but is beginning to happen. The honest but less cautious answer, drawing on the full context of what we know about Aboriginal Australian culture, the geological history of the shelf, the oral traditions of the coastal communities, and the specific character of the anomalies in the sonar data, is this: there is something down there. It is probably not a lost city in the dramatic sense that popular culture would recognize. It is probably not temples or towers or anything that looks like what Europeans think of when they think of ancient construction. It is probably, in its physical form, something more like Budge Bim or Brewarina than like Angkor Wat or the Great Pyramid. But in its significance, in what it would mean for our understanding of the human story on this continent and on this planet, it might be larger than any of those things, because it would be the oldest, and because the people whose ancestors built it are still here. That combination, the oldest physical evidence of human construction, created by a culture whose living descendants maintain unbroken connection to it, is unique. It cannot be found anywhere else on Earth in quite the same way. The most ancient sites of human construction elsewhere are sites of cultures that are extinct. Göbekli Tepe was built by people whose descendants we cannot identify. The caves of Lascaux were painted by people whose cultural lineage we can only guess at. The megalithic monuments of Europe are the work of cultures so thoroughly displaced by later migrations that the connection between the builders and any living people is tenuous at best. But the structures on the inner shelf of the Great Barrier Reef, if they are there and when they are found, will have living custodians, people whose oral traditions have been preserving memory of those structures and of the landscape they were built in for 10,000 years. People whose relationship to those waters is not the relationship of outsiders studying an ancient wonder, but of descendants returning to the place where their ancestors lived. That is a story different in kind from any other ancient site story that has been told, and it is waiting under the water to be told properly. The sea is not silent about what it contains. The sonar data speaks, the geology speaks, the oral traditions speak. The DNA of the people who have lived here longest speaks. All of these voices are saying the same thing, in different registers and with different degrees of specificity. There was something here before the water came. The water came, the something is still there. We need to look, not casually, not optimistically, carefully, rigorously, in partnership with the communities whose heritage it is, using the best tools available and with the willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, including to conclusions that will require us to revise everything we thought we knew about how old the human story on this continent really is, and how sophisticated the people who wrote the first chapters of that story really were. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the wonders of the natural world. The drowned coast beneath it may be one of the wonders of the human world. The fact that those two wonders occupy the same location, stacked on top of each other across the dimension of time, is not a coincidence. It is the intersection of a biological history and a human history that are both deeper, stranger, and more remarkable than the versions we have been telling. The story of Australia's lost megastructures beneath the Great Barrier Reef is not a finished story. It does not have an ending yet because the investigation has not been done. It has a beginning. It has a middle that is still being written in field reports and journal papers and conversations between researchers and community members in Queensland. And it has a possible ending that, if the evidence comes together the way some of the most careful and thoughtful researchers in this area expect it to, will be one of the great archaeological announcements of the 21st century. What sleeps beneath the water is older than any known monument, older than Egypt, older than Mesopotamia, older than the agricultural revolution that we tend to treat as the beginning of civilization. It was built by people whose descendants still live, whose memories still echo with fragments of what was built and what was lost. The reef grows over it. The sea keeps it. The traditions remember it. And somewhere out there, a research vessel is charting a course toward water that has not been properly looked at yet. Beneath the waves, under 10,000 years of salt and sediment and coral growth, the drowned coast waits. Something's there, and it will be found. There is a particular moment in the research process that every scientist who has worked on this problem describes in roughly the same way, even though they experienced it in different circumstances and at different points in their careers. It is the moment when you stop looking at the data as a technical problem to be solved and start understanding it as a story that is trying to be told. The sonar images stop being a collection of acoustic return values arranged in a two-dimensional matrix, and start being a landscape that was once above the waterline, a landscape that once had air above it and sunlight falling on it, and people walking across it. That moment does not happen at a computer screen. It happens when the numbers and the images and the geological context and the oral traditions and the genetic evidence and everything else that has been accumulating in your mind over the years of working on this problem suddenly assembles itself into something coherent, into a place. A real place that existed and was inhabited and was lost. The researchers who have had that moment describe it as unsettling, not in a frightening way, in the way that something is unsettling when it is larger than the frame you were trying to put it in, when you realize that the question you are asking is a smaller question than the question that the evidence is actually answering. The question they started with was, are there archaeological sites on the inner shelf of the Great Barrier Reef? The question the evidence is actually answering is something closer to, what was the civilization of coastal Australia like during the 20,000 years when the shelf was exposed, and what did it leave behind? Those are different questions. The first is a specific, answerable archaeological question with a binary outcome. Either there are sites or there are not. The second is a question about the character, the depth, the sophistication, and the material legacy of a cultural system that developed over an enormous span of time in some of the most productive coastal environments on Earth. The evidence, taken together, suggests that the answer to the second question is going to be much larger than anyone expected, because the cultural system that developed on those coasts was not primitive, was not static, was not limited in the ways that the standard narrative has assumed. It was sophisticated, it was dynamic, it was innovative, it produced the kind of cultural achievements that, in other contexts, we label as civilization without any hesitation. The hesitation to apply that label in the Australian context is not scientific, it is political. It is the residue of a worldview that was constructed to justify a specific kind of colonial relationship, and that has been remarkably difficult to dislodge from the institutions that were built around it. The dismantling of that worldview is happening. It is happening through the accumulation of evidence from sites like Budge Bim and Brew Arena. It is happening through the increasing sophistication of the research on Aboriginal oral traditions and their accuracy as historical records. It is happening through the genetic evidence that documents the length and continuity of Aboriginal occupation. And it will happen dramatically and potentially irreversibly through the physical discovery of what is on the inner shelf beneath the reef. The timing of that discovery matters, not because the significance of what is found will depend on when it is found, but because the interpretive context in which it is found will shape how it is understood and communicated. A discovery made in an interpretive context that still defaults to the old narrative will be assimilated more slowly and with more resistance than a discovery made when the context has shifted enough to receive it properly. That context is shifting. The pace is frustratingly slow for the researchers who understand what is at stake. But the direction is clear. The growing field of Indigenous archaeology, which treats Aboriginal communities as partners in the research process rather than as objects of study or sources of cultural artifacts, is producing a generation of researchers who are comfortable with the kind of collaborative, long-term, relationship-intensive work that this question requires. The growing field of maritime archaeology, which has been expanding its range from historically documented shipwrecks into much older submerged sites, is developing the technical toolkit and the institutional frameworks for doing the underwater investigation work that this question requires. The growing field of archaeogenetics, which uses ancient DNA to reconstruct the deep history of human populations, is providing the biological context within which the archaeological evidence can be interpreted. These three fields, converging on the question of the drowned coastal landscape of Australia, are producing something new, a research approach that is technically capable, culturally responsible, and scientifically rigorous enough to actually answer the question of what is under the water. The question of whether it will happen quickly enough, given the combination of sea level rise, ongoing bottom disturbance from fishing and industrial activity, and the general vulnerability of seafloor sites to deterioration over time, is one that the researchers most closely involved with this work view with some anxiety. There is a sense of urgency that is not always visible in the cautious language of published papers, but that is very present in the conversations between researchers and between researchers and communities. The urgency is real. The window is not infinite. The sites that might exist on the inner shelf are under pressure from multiple directions. Climate change is affecting the water chemistry of the shelf in ways that could accelerate the dissolution of carbonate material. Sea level rise, already adding centimeters per decade, will continue to affect the hydrological dynamics of the shallow shelf environment. The cumulative impact of decades of trawling on soft substrate areas of the shelf has disturbed whatever was on the surface in those areas, and the disturbance continues. Against this urgency, the pace of research feels inadequate. The community of researchers actively working on this specific question is small. The funding is limited. The institutional support is uneven. The political will to treat this as a priority rather than as an interesting but marginal research question has not yet materialized at the level that would make a real difference. The argument that could change this is not a scientific argument. It is a cultural argument. It is the argument that what is at stake here is not just an interesting data point for the academic literature, but a fundamental component of Australian national identity and cultural heritage, that the question of what Aboriginal Australians built and lived in the 65,000 years before European contact is not a peripheral question for Australian society, but a central one. That the drowned coastal landscape of the Great Barrier Reef shelf is not a geological curiosity, but a national heritage site of the first order. Making that argument effectively requires the kind of public communication that academic researchers are not always well positioned to do. It requires documentary films and books for general audiences, and journalism that translates the careful language of the research into a form that non-specialists can engage with and care about. It requires the kind of cultural investment in the question that follows from a society that has collectively decided it wants to know the answer. Australian society has not, as a whole, made that decision yet, but there are signs that it is moving in that direction. The recognition of Budge Bim as a World Heritage Site in 2019 was a significant marker. The growing public interest in the question of deep Aboriginal history, driven in part by the popular success of books and documentaries that tell that story in accessible ways, is creating an audience for this research. The increasing prominence of Aboriginal voices in public discourse about Australian history and identity is changing the terms on which the question is asked. All of this is background noise in the current moment. The research is happening at its own pace, in its own institutional context, driven by the conviction of a small group of people who understand what is at stake. But the background noise matters. It is the cultural context within which the research exists, and it shapes the conditions under which future discoveries will be received. When the discovery comes, it will land in a different cultural context than it would have landed in 20 years ago, a context more prepared to receive it, more willing to understand it as what it is, more capable of integrating it into a revised understanding of Australian and human history. That revised understanding is, in its bones, a simpler and more accurate story than the one it replaces. It is a story in which the people who have been on this continent for 65,000 years, who built aquaculture systems and fish traps and managed the continent's ecology with a sophisticated body of knowledge that took tens of thousands of years to develop, are seen as what they always were, the inheritors and continuers of the longest unbroken cultural tradition on Earth. The builders of the first civilizations on this continent, the people who walked on the land that is now beneath the Great Barrier Reef, who built things there, who remembered what they built, and whose memories have been waiting for 10,000 years for someone to come looking for what they described. The waiting is almost over. There is also a dimension of this story that extends beyond the specific question of the Great Barrier Reef and into the broader question of how we understand the relationship between human culture and the physical environment over deep time. One of the most persistent assumptions in the standard model of human cultural development is that civilization, meaning complex social organization, monumental construction, and the kind of landscape modification associated with settled agricultural societies, is a relatively recent phenomenon, 5,000 years old at most in the conventional account. The product of the transition from nomadic foraging to settled agriculture that began in a few specific locations in the Middle East, East Asia, and the Americas around 10 to 12,000 years ago. This timeline, this model, has been challenged on multiple fronts. Göbekli Tepe, with its complex carved monuments predating agriculture by at least 1,000 years, challenged the idea that monumental construction required an agricultural surplus to support it. The genetic evidence for complex population structures and trade networks far older than the agricultural revolution has challenged the idea that complex social organization required agriculture. The evidence from Budge Bim and Brewarina and dozens of other sites across Australia has challenged the idea that Australia was outside the story of cultural complexity altogether. The pattern across all of these challenges is the same. The standard model underestimated the age of complexity. It placed the beginning of sophisticated human culture at the moment when the evidence for it became legible to the methods and assumptions of early 20th century archaeology, and it treated that moment of legibility as the actual beginning rather than as an artifact of the evidence available. The drowned coastal landscapes of the world, including the inner shelf of the Great Barrier Reef, represent a category of evidence that early 20th century archaeology had no access to and no framework for interpreting. As that evidence becomes accessible through improving technology, through collaborative research frameworks, through the integration of indigenous knowledge into research design, it is consistently pushing the story of human complexity further back in time and broader in geographic scope than the standard model predicted. The implications of this are not just academic, they are philosophical. If complex cultural organization, sophisticated engineering, and deliberate landscape modification go back not 5,000 years, but 20, 30, 50,000 years, then the story of what human beings are and what we are capable of is a different story from the one we have been telling. The capacity for these things is not a recent acquisition. It is not something that emerged with agriculture and cities and writing and the other markers of the standard definition of civilization. It is an ancient capacity present in our species for most of our existence, expressed in different ways and at different scales in different contexts. In Australia, that capacity was expressed across tens of thousands of years of occupation of a continent that was, in some ways, the most challenging and in other ways the most abundant on Earth. The people who inhabited it developed, over that time, a body of ecological and cultural knowledge that produced the specific achievements we know about. Budgebim, Brewerina, the burning regimes, the trade networks, the oral traditions. And that may also have produced things we do not yet know about, things that are sitting on the seafloor of the inner shelf, waiting to be found. The philosophical implication of finding those things would be significant. It would contribute to a growing body of evidence that the human capacity for sophisticated cultural achievement is much older and much more widely distributed than the standard model allows. It would suggest that what we call civilization is not a recent invention, but a recurring expression of capacities that have been present in our species and in some of our immediate ancestors for a very long time. That is a story that connects the specific question of the Great Barrier Reef shelf to the broadest questions about human nature and human history. It is a story that has implications not just for how we understand the past, but for how we understand ourselves in the present. If the capacity for sophisticated cultural organization, for environmental stewardship at landscape scale, for long-term planning and collective investment in the built environment is not a recent acquisition but an ancient endowment, then the questions we ask about that capacity in the present look different. The catastrophic environmental degradation of the present moment is often framed as the inevitable consequence of civilization, of the agricultural and industrial transformation of the planet that began 10,000 years ago. But if the Budgebim comparison is right, if Aboriginal Australians were managing ecosystems sustainably and constructing lasting infrastructure for 65,000 years without destroying the ecological systems they depended on, then the destructive character of the past 200 years of industrial civilization is not the natural endpoint of human cultural development. It is a specific, historically contingent failure mode, a failure to draw on the full depth of what the human species knows about managing its relationship with the natural world. The knowledge is still here, the communities that hold it are still here, and the evidence of what it produced in the years when it was applied to the coastal plain that is now beneath the reef may be about to become visible for the first time in 10,000 years. The connection between the physical discovery and the cultural context in which it is received is therefore significant in a way that goes beyond the immediate academic and heritage implications. Finding the structures, if they are there, would not just tell us something about the past, it would tell us something about the present, about what is possible, about what has already been achieved, about what kinds of relationship between human communities and the natural world have worked over timescales long enough to matter. This is not a romantic or utopian argument. It is an empirical one. The data from Budgebim and Brewerina and the other large-scale engineering and management systems of Aboriginal Australia are actual data about the outcomes of actual management practices over actual timescales. What those data show is that complex, productive, sustainable management of coastal and inland aquatic resources at landscape scale is possible. It was done. It worked for a very long time. If analogous systems existed on the shelf that is now underwater, the evidence of them would add to that dataset. It would extend the demonstrated record of sustainable land and water management by Aboriginal Australians to the most productive coastal environments they inhabited, the coastal plains and estuaries that are now beneath the sea. That extension of the record would matter, not as a moral lesson, not as a piece of inspiration, but as empirical evidence about what human cultural capacity has already achieved in specific ecological contexts. Evidence that is currently missing because the most relevant sites are underwater. The argument for finding those sites is therefore not only an argument about heritage, about cultural continuity, about giving Aboriginal Australians credit for what their ancestors built. It is an argument about the quality of the human record, about filling in the blanks in a story that is incomplete, and that the blanks in which are consequential for how we understand what we are capable of and what we have already done. These are large claims for a research program that has not yet produced a single confirmed site on the inner shelf. They are claims being made in anticipation of what the research will find, based on what we already know about the people who inhabited that shelf and about the kind of evidence that comparable research in comparable contexts has produced elsewhere. The claims may be wrong. The inner shelf may have been inhabited in ways that did not produce structures durable enough to survive submergence. The anomalies in the sonar data may have natural explanations that become clear when investigated at higher resolution. The oral traditions may be preserving memories of features that were natural formations rather than constructed ones. All of these are genuine possibilities, but the probability that they are true is lower than the probability that something significant is there, given what we know about the length and sophistication of Aboriginal coastal occupation and the character of the geological and oral evidence. The reasonable scientific position is that the investigation should be done and that the results should be interpreted without prejudice toward either a positive or a negative conclusion. What would a negative conclusion mean? It would mean that the coastal peoples of the glacial maximum did not leave durable structures on the inner shelf, or that those structures did not survive the submergence in a detectable form. That would be a significant result in its own right. It would help define the upper limit of what the investigation can hope to find, and it would refocus attention on other kinds of evidence. Organic material and sediment cores, distribution patterns of worked stone in surface samples, any of a range of archaeological signatures that do not require standing structures. A negative result on the specific question of megastructures would not be a negative result on the broader question of whether the shelf was inhabited and whether evidence of that habitation survives. Those are separate questions, and the answer to them might be positive, even if the answer to the megastructure question specifically is negative. The research program needed to answer all of these questions is the same program, a comprehensive, systematic, multi-method investigation of the inner shelf, conducted in collaboration with traditional owner communities, with sufficient resolution and coverage to detect and characterize whatever is there. That program needs to happen. The resources to do it exist. The scientific capability to do it exists. The community partnerships to enable it are being built. What has been missing is the combination of political will and institutional focus to make it a priority. Building that combination is the task of the next decade. It is a task being worked on by researchers and community members and heritage advocates who understand the significance of what they are looking for and why it matters to find it. The Great Barrier Reef will continue to draw the world's attention for its living wonders. The bleaching events, the biodiversity, the extraordinary beauty of the coral ecosystem. These things will continue to be documented and discussed and mourned and celebrated. In the background of all that attention, the question of what lies beneath in the drowned landscape of the inner shelf will continue to be investigated by the small community of people who have committed to answering it. When they find what they are looking for, the attention will shift. The story of the reef will become larger than it currently is. It will encompass not just the living system of the present, but the inhabited landscape of the past. It will include the people who were there before the water came, and the things they built and the memories they kept. It will be a story worth waiting for. The ocean does not give up its secrets easily. Every significant submerged archaeological discovery in history has required sustained, patient, technically demanding work before the evidence yielded itself to interpretation. The underwater sites of the Mediterranean, the finds from Doggerland in the North Sea, the drowned caves and river systems of the Gulf of Mexico, the submerged volcanoes and island chains of the Pacific, all of these required years or decades of careful investigation before they produced results that the mainstream had to take seriously. The inner shelf of the Great Barrier Reef will be no different. The road from the current state of suggestive anomalies and promising oral traditions to a confirmed, described, dated archaeological complex is a long one. It requires crossing many disciplinary and institutional barriers. It requires sustained investment of time, resources, and relationship. It requires patience with a process that does not produce dramatic results quickly. But it also requires the conviction that the result is worth pursuing, the conviction that what is down there is real, that it is significant, and that finding it and understanding it and communicating it is something that matters. Not just to the researchers, not just to the communities whose heritage it is, but to the much larger community of people who want to understand where they come from, and how long the human story really goes, and what people have been capable of for far longer than the standard narrative allows. That conviction is present in the research community working on this question. It is present in the Aboriginal communities whose oral traditions have been preserving the memory of the drowned coast for 10,000 years. It is present in a less focused but nonetheless real way in the growing number of people around the world who are becoming interested in the deep history of human culture and who are beginning to understand that the story is longer and stranger and more remarkable than they were taught. The discovery, when it comes, will be for all of them. It will be for the researchers who spent careers building toward it. It will be for the communities whose ancestors built what is found. It will be for the broader public that wants to understand itself better, to know more of its own story, to fill in the chapters that have been missing. And it will be, in a very specific sense, a gift from the water. From the ocean that covered those coastal plains 10,000 years ago and has been holding what was there ever since. Not perfectly, not without damage, but holding it against the odds through tides and storms and the slow dissolving chemistry of the sea, until the moment when someone comes with the right tools and the right questions and the right relationships to understand what they have found. That moment is approaching. Not today, not next year, but approaching in the way that the sea approaches a shoreline. Steadily, inevitably, with the weight of everything that is driving it toward this point. The drowned coast of Australia is the oldest chapter of the human story on this continent. The work of finding and reading that chapter is one of the most important archaeological projects of the 21st century, and the sea, patient as it always has been, is waiting for us to come and look. What we will find there is the truth about something we thought we already knew. The truth about who was here and how long they were here and what they did while they were here, before the water came and changed everything. The truth is older than we thought, and it is under the reef, waiting, as all the deepest truths wait, for the ones who have the patience and the will and the courage to go looking for them in the right places. The right place is beneath the water, off the coast of Queensland, on the inner shelf of the Great Barrier Reef, in the drowned landscape of a coast that was inhabited for tens of thousands of years by people whose descendants are still here. Go look. The story's there. There is a specific kind of silence that exists underwater. Anyone who has spent time beneath the surface of the ocean knows it. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of a different medium, a different acoustic world in which the sounds that organize human experience on land are replaced by other sounds, lower, stranger, carrying further, meaning different things. The click of snapping shrimp, the low-frequency boom of a distant whale, the hiss and rush of current over rough substrate. These sounds fill the underwater world in a way that is, to a human listener, deeply unfamiliar. And in that unfamiliarity, there is something that feels, even to the most rigorously scientific of researchers, like a kind of patience. Like the ocean is not simply holding what is in it, like it is waiting. The inner shelf of the Great Barrier Reef is not silent underwater. It is one of the most acoustically active marine environments on Earth. The biological density of even the degraded inner reef system produces a constant biological soundscape: fish calls, invertebrate clicks, the sounds of feeding and mating, and territorial display. Add to that the ambient noise of wave action, current, the occasional boat motor above, and the result is an environment that is, by the physical definition of the term, very far from silent. But there is a different kind of silence on the seafloor itself. In the areas of the inner shelf where the substrate is hard and the biological cover is thick, where you are close to the bottom looking at what is right in front of you, the world contracts to a small circle of visibility, a few meters in every direction, and everything beyond that circle is dark. The sounds are present, but they are not, in that moment, organizing. They are background. And in the foreground you have whatever the seafloor offers you: rock, coral, sand, the occasional fish moving through the frame. And in some places the edges of things that you cannot quite make out because the visibility is not good enough and the biological cover is too thick. Those are the places that matter. Those are the places that the researchers are heading toward when the research begins in earnest. The places where the sonar data showed something that warranted a closer look, where the oral traditions placed something worth looking for, where the geological context makes the presence of something meaningful plausible. In those places, under the noise and the life and the water, the oldest evidence of human construction in Australia, and potentially on Earth, may be waiting. The character of what is waiting matters. We have been speaking of structures, of megastructures of construction. It is worth being specific about what, given everything we know about Aboriginal Australian engineering and culture, those structures might actually be. The term megastructure can mislead. It conjures images of the kind of large-scale architecture that appears in Egypt or Mesoamerica or Cambodia. Massive stone monuments, elaborately carved facades, the kind of construction that produces an immediately recognizable built form even after millennia of exposure and erosion. That is probably not what is on the inner shelf. What is probably there is something both more modest in its individual components and more significant in its aggregate effect. Consider what Budge BIM actually is. At the scale of an individual component, it is a stone weir, rocks placed in a stream to funnel water and fish in a desired direction. No individual component is impressive in isolation. What is impressive is the system. The network of weirs, channels, and holding ponds spread across kilometers of landscape, calibrated to the hydrological characteristics of specific water bodies, maintained and modified over generations, functioning together as an integrated management system. The significance is in the integration and the scale, not in the impressiveness of any single element. What was built on the coastal plain that is now the inner shelf was probably similar. Weirs and holding ponds in the estuaries of the drowned river systems, clearance and modification of the riverbanks to make them more productive, stone arrangements at the margins of the coastal wetlands that would have developed at the contact between the rivers and the sea. Perhaps larger and more formal constructions at the sites of concentrated human settlement, where generations of people returned season after season and invested in the infrastructure that made those places productive. None of these things would be immediately recognizable as human construction to a researcher looking at them on a seafloor covered in coral and sediment. They would require careful investigation, sample collection, dating, and comparison with known analogs before their anthropogenic origin could be established. They would not produce the kind of immediate visual impression that makes a discovery obvious. They would require the application of expert knowledge to distinguish them from the natural features of the seafloor. This is not a reason to doubt that they are there. It is a description of the nature of the evidence and the kind of investigation needed to find and interpret it. The fish traps at Brew Arena were not immediately recognizable to the first European settlers who encountered them as the sophisticated engineering systems they are. They looked, to eyes trained on European forms of construction, like natural rock formations in the river. It took careful attention and the guidance of the Ngemba people who built and maintained them to understand what they were. On the seafloor, a similar process will be required. The evidence will not announce itself. It will need to be found, recognized, interpreted, and confirmed through careful work. The natural features of the shelf will provide noise around the signal. But the signal is there, if the logic of what we know about Aboriginal coastal occupation holds. And there is every reason to think it holds. The coastal environment of the inner shelf during the glacial maximum was not a marginal or difficult place. It was a coastal plain adjacent to a productive marine environment, backed by the ranges and rivers of northeastern Australia, enjoying a climate that was drier and cooler than the present, but still within the range supporting dense human habitation. The people who lived there had access to marine resources from the shelf, fresh water from the rivers, terrestrial resources from the coastal plain, and connections through the river systems to the upland environments of the Queensland ranges. This is, in archaeological terms, an ideal setting. Multiple resource zones, reliable water, defensible topographic features, easy communication along the coast and up the rivers. The kind of environment that, in every other part of the world where we have found it, supported dense, complex, socially organized human communities with a strong investment in the landscape. The people of northeastern Australia during the glacial maximum were not different in their fundamental cultural capacity from the people of northwestern Europe or the Levant during the same period. They had the same cognitive capabilities, the same social needs, the same potential for cultural complexity. What they built was shaped by their specific environment, their specific resources, and their specific cultural traditions. But they built. And what they built in an environment as rich and as suitable as the inner shelf of the Great Barrier Reef was probably significant. The time span of that construction matters too. 20,000 years is a long time. It is not the 40,000 or 60,000 years of the full Aboriginal occupation of Australia, but it encompasses most of the period during which the coastal plain was at its most accessible and most productive. 20,000 years of human communities investing in the landscape, building and maintaining fish management systems, modifying the coastal wetlands, constructing the kinds of permanent infrastructure that produce the returns that justify the investment. In 20,000 years of sustained investment in a landscape, the cumulative effect is significant. Even if each individual generation's contribution was modest, the aggregate over 20,000 years of maintenance and expansion and modification would be substantial. The scale of what was eventually there at the end of that process, just before the sea rose and covered it, might have been large indeed. This is speculative. It necessarily is. but it is speculation grounded in what we know about the rates of cultural investment and landscape modification that Aboriginal peoples demonstrated in the contexts where we can measure it. Budge BIM has been developing for at least 6,600 years, and its scale is already remarkable. Extrapolate that investment rate to 20,000 years of coastal occupation, and the result would be something very large. The oral traditions of the Queensland coastal peoples are not specific about scale. They are specific about character, about the presence of features that were made rather than natural, about the location of those features in relation to specific geographical contexts, about the significance of those features to the communities that use them. But they do not give dimensions. They do not describe something of a specific size or configuration in a way that would allow a researcher to predict what the sonar data should show. This is appropriate. Oral traditions are not engineering records. They are not intended to preserve the kind of information that would be useful for an archaeological survey. They preserve what matters to the communities that maintain them, which is the significance of places, the relationships between features and the people who use them, the cultural meaning of the landscape. That kind of information is invaluable in its own right, and it is exactly the kind of information needed to guide research. But it does not substitute for the sonar data and the core samples and the direct investigation that the physical evidence requires. The combination of all three kinds of evidence, traditional knowledge, geological data, and direct archaeological investigation, is what is needed to actually answer the question. Each alone is insufficient. Together, they might be enough. The process of bringing them together is the research program that is slowly taking shape. It is not a program that was designed all at once by a single research team with a unified vision. It is emerging from the convergence of several independent streams of work, each approaching the question from a different direction, each contributing a different piece of the picture. The marine geologists brought the sonar data. The anomalies were in their data sets before anyone was specifically looking for them as evidence of human activity. The anomalies were there because the seafloor produced them, and the surveys were comprehensive enough to capture them. The interpretation of those anomalies as potentially anthropogenic came later, when researchers with knowledge of the archaeological context reviewed the data with that question in mind. The archaeologists brought the cultural context, the knowledge of what Aboriginal peoples built on the exposed landscape, the understanding of how aquaculture and landscape management systems express themselves in the archaeological record, the framework for interpreting the specific kinds of features that might be expected on the inner shelf. Without that context, the sonar anomalies would remain geological curiosities without archaeological significance. The linguists and anthropologists brought the oral tradition analysis, the framework for understanding how specific kinds of information can be preserved in oral traditions over millennial timescales, the techniques for identifying geographically specific content in traditional narratives, the collaborative methods for working with communities in ways that extract meaningful information from oral traditions without distorting or appropriating them. The traditional knowledge holders brought the traditions themselves, the specific geographical orientations, the descriptions of features, the memories of what was where, information that cannot be obtained by any other means, and that is, in the most straightforward sense, evidence. Not the kind of evidence that can be published in a geological or archaeological journal as proof of anything, but the kind of evidence that is essential for designing the research that will produce publishable proof. These streams of work are converging. The people involved are becoming aware of each other, beginning to talk to each other, beginning to think about how their different pieces of the picture fit together. The institutional structures are slowly being built to support the collaboration. The funding, in small amounts, is beginning to flow. The result is not yet a research program in the full sense. It is a proto-program, an emerging research capacity that is not yet organized enough to be submitted to a funding body as a coherent proposal, but that is developing toward that organization. The researchers involved are doing the preliminary work, the relationship building, the data sharing, the conceptual synthesis that needs to happen before the formal research can begin. The timeline from where things are now to where they need to be, meaning fully funded, properly permitted, collaborative, systematic survey of the inner shelf, is not short. The people most directly involved estimate that the preliminary work of building the collaborative framework and doing the initial small-scale investigations needed to justify a major funding application could take 3 to 5 years. The major investigation itself, if funded, would take another 5 to 10 years to produce a comprehensive picture of the inner shelf. So The timescale to a definitive answer is probably measured in decades from the current moment. That is a long time, but it is not an infinite time. And the preliminary work is already happening. The years are already passing. The research is already advancing in the slow, patient way that this kind of research advances. In that time, other things are also happening. The technology is improving. High-resolution autonomous underwater vehicle surveys that would have been impossibly expensive a decade ago are becoming routine. AI-assisted analysis of sonar data is beginning to automate some of the interpretive work that previously required expert manual review. Satellite imagery of shallow water environments is improving in resolution. The analytical tools available for dating and characterizing recovered material are becoming more sensitive. Environmental DNA analysis, which can detect the presence of organisms including humans in sediment core samples, is opening entirely new lines of inquiry. By the time the major investigation of the inner shelf actually begins, the toolkit available for doing it will be substantially better than the toolkit available today. The features that are currently at the limit of interpretability in existing sonar data may be clearly legible in the higher resolution surveys that will be possible in 5 years. The sediment core analysis that currently requires large samples and produces limited temporal resolution may be capable of producing far more detailed results from far smaller samples. The combination of improving technology and the collaborative research framework being built will, when they are both ready, produce an investigation of the inner shelf that is genuinely capable of answering the question. Not perfectly, not all at once, but systematically, piece by piece, building the kind of evidence base that allows confident conclusions. The confident conclusion, when it comes, will be stated carefully. It will acknowledge the limitations of the evidence. It will note the alternative interpretations that were considered and the reasons they were rejected. It will be specific about what has been confirmed and what remains uncertain. This is how science communicates, and it is the right way to communicate findings of this magnitude. But beneath the careful language, the conclusion will be clear. There was a civilization of coastal peoples on the inner shelf of the Great Barrier Reef. They were there for tens of thousands of years. They built things. Those things have survived, and they are among the oldest human constructions on Earth. That conclusion, when it is stated and supported and peer-reviewed and replicated and eventually accepted by the mainstream, will be one of the most significant statements in the history of Australian archaeology. It will revise the story of this continent's human history more dramatically than any single discovery since the recognition of the deep antiquity of Aboriginal occupation in the 1960s. It will also, in ways that are hard to predict in advance, change the story of the reef itself. The Great Barrier Reef will no longer be understood only as a natural wonder. It will be understood as both a natural wonder and a heritage site, a place where the living ecology and the human archaeology are superimposed, where the biological history and the cultural history occupy the same water column, where the natural and the human are not separate stories, but one integrated story going back to the beginning of human presence on this continent. That integrated story is the real story of the Great Barrier Reef, not the story of coral alone. The story of coral and of the people who lived on the shores and waters of its predecessors for tens of thousands of years before the sea rose and the modern reef took its current form. The reef is not just a natural system, it is a cultural system. It has been in relationship with human beings for as long as human beings have been in Australia. The cultures that developed along its shores, on the coastal plain that became its seafloor, the cultures that fished its waters, built their infrastructure in its estuaries, and remembered it in their oral traditions after the sea covered it. Those cultures are part of what the reef is, inseparable from it, as fundamental to its complete story as the coral polyps that built the physical structure. Finding the evidence of those cultures on the seafloor will not change what the reef is, but it will change what we know that it is. And what we know about it, the story we tell about it, shapes how we value it, how we protect it, how we relate to it. A reef that is understood as both a natural wonder and a cultural heritage site of the deepest possible significance is a reef that is valued differently from one that is understood as only a natural wonder. The additional dimension of meaning does not diminish the ecological significance. It adds to it. It creates a more complex and more complete understanding of why this place matters, and has mattered and will continue to matter. For the Aboriginal peoples of the Queensland coast, this additional dimension is not new. They have always understood the reef in this way. It has always been, for them, both a natural environment and a cultural landscape. The distinction between nature and culture that dominates Western environmental thinking is not a distinction that organizes Aboriginal relationship to country. The reef, the sea, the land, the sky, the ancestors, the living community, all of these are aspects of one integrated reality, not separate domains to be analyzed independently. Bringing the Western scientific understanding of the reef into alignment with that more integrated perspective is one of the outcomes that the research on the drowned coast of the inner shelf might produce, not because the science is adopting an Aboriginal worldview, but because the science is discovering in the data a complexity and a depth of relationship between the human and the natural in this environment that requires a more integrated framework to understand. This is the frontier where the most interesting science is happening right now, not just in Australia, globally. The frontier where the long separation between natural science and cultural science, between ecology and archaeology, between the study of the physical world and the study of the human relationship to the physical world is being bridged, where researchers are discovering that the distinction was always, to some degree, artificial, that the natural environments we study have been shaped by human activity for far longer and at far greater scale than we previously assumed, and that the human cultures we study were shaped in turn by the natural environments in which they developed. The drowned coast of the Great Barrier Reef is one of the places where that bridging is happening. And when the research is done, the results will contribute to a more complete picture, not just of this specific place and its history, but of the relationship between human culture and the natural world over the deep time of human existence on Earth. That is a large claim for a research program that is still in its early stages. But the evidence that supports the claim is already present in what we know. The scale of the Aboriginal impact on the Australian landscape over 65,000 years. The sophistication of the ecological knowledge that made that impact sustainable. The specificity of the oral traditions that preserve memory of the coastal landscapes that are now underwater. The anomalies in the sonar data that point toward the presence of features that natural processes did not create. All of this points towards something specific and significant on the inner shelf. Something that, when found, will be worth everything that finding it required. The ocean does not rush. It erodes, deposits, dissolves, accumulates over timescales that make human urgency look like impatience. The inner shelf has been underwater for 10,000 years. It has been waiting in the only sense that a physical environment can wait, which is simply the sense that it continues to exist. That what is in it remains in it, that the features of the seafloor do not spontaneously disappear, simply because no one is looking at them. The patience of the seafloor is a kind of invitation, not to slowness, not to complacency, but to the kind of sustained, careful attention that the question deserves. The question of what is there has been building for decades. The tools to answer it have been developing. The relationships needed to pursue it are being established. The answer is coming, not today, not this year, but coming with the same inevitability with which the sea rose and covered the coast 10,000 years ago. Building toward the moment of disclosure, when what has been hidden becomes visible, when what has been waiting becomes found. Under the Great Barrier Reef, on the inner shelf, in the drowned landscape of the oldest inhabited coast in the world, the human story is waiting to be recovered. The oldest chapter of the Australian story, the chapter written on the coastal plain before the sea came, is there. In the sediment, in the hard substrate, in the specific geometry of features that nature did not make. It is there, and it will be found. And when it is found, the story of what it means, what it tells us about the depth and the character of human cultural achievement on this continent and on this planet, will be told. That story begins in the water. It ends with understanding that the water is not a boundary between the human and the natural, between the cultural and the geological. It is a medium in which all of these things coexist, in which the human past and the natural present share the same space, in which the oldest evidence of human construction and the living wonder of the reef occupy the same water column. The Great Barrier Reef, the wonder of the present, the archive of the past, the place where 10,000 years of water have held the oldest chapter of the human story in trust, waiting for the moment when we are ready to come and read it. That moment is almost here. If you have stayed with this story through these hours, it is because something in it resonated with you. Maybe the mystery, maybe the sense of scale, maybe the connection between the deep past and the living present. Maybe just the strangeness of it, the idea that something ancient and significant is sitting at the bottom of one of the most famous bodies of water on Earth. Unrecognized, unstudied, waiting. Stay curious. The ocean has more stories in it than any generation has been able to read. The people who have been here longest, whose traditions have preserved more of those stories than any archive, are still here, still connected, still willing to share the memory of what the water covers. And the researchers who are working at the intersection of those traditions and the sonar data and the sediment cores are slowly, carefully, patiently building toward the kind of discovery that changes everything. Watch for it, it is coming. There is a word that comes up frequently in the conversations between researchers working on the Drowned Coast question and the Aboriginal communities whose traditions speak to it. The word is country. It is used in a specific and significant way in Aboriginal Australian English, not as a synonym for nation or for rural landscape, but as a term for a place of deep belonging. Country is the land and the water and the sky that a community has relationship with. It is not owned in the Western legal sense. It is more like family. You belong to it as much as it belongs to you. The connection is reciprocal, mutual, and goes back as far as memory goes. For the peoples of the Queensland coast, country extends into the water. It does not end at the current shoreline. The sea is part of country, the reef is part of country, and the sea floor, the drowned coastal plain where the ancestors walked, where the fresh water met the salt, where the fish traps and the holding ponds and the constructed wetlands that supported dense human communities once existed. That is part of country too. This is not a metaphorical claim. It is a description of a real cultural relationship that has been maintained across the disruption of colonization, across the inundation of the coastal plain, across 10,000 years of rising water. The knowledge that the sea covers land that was once inhabited, that it covers places that mattered to the ancestors, that it covers things that the ancestors made, has been part of the tradition of these communities through all of that time. When researchers approach these communities and ask about the sea, about what is in it, about what might be down there, the communities are not being asked to imagine something new. They are being asked to share something old. Very old. The knowledge is already there. The question is whether the research can find a way to receive that knowledge, to work with it in ways that respect the cultural protocols surrounding it, and to translate the specific geographical and descriptive content of it into the kind of evidence that the scientific establishment requires. That translation is the hardest part of the research, not the sonar surveys, not the core sampling, not the ROV deployment. The translation between different ways of knowing the same place, between the scientific and the traditional, between the data and the story, between the kind of evidence that a peer-reviewed journal accepts and the kind of evidence that has been preserved in oral tradition for 10,000 years. Some researchers are better at this translation than others. The ones who are best at it tend to be the ones who have spent the most time in relationship with the communities, who have learned to listen in ways that go beyond the obvious content of what is said, who understand that the protocols around knowledge sharing in Aboriginal culture are not obstacles to research, but are themselves a form of wisdom about how knowledge should be handled. The knowledge that is shared in the right conditions, in the right relationships, with the right protocols observed, is different in character from knowledge extracted without those conditions. It is more specific. It is more geographically precise. It is more deeply connected to the other knowledge that gives it meaning. It is, in other words, more useful for the purpose of knowing where to look. The research program that will eventually find what is on the inner shelf will be structured to create the conditions for this kind of knowledge sharing. Not as a methodological add-on, not as a community consultation checkbox, but as a core component of the research design. The communities whose traditions speak to the character of the Drowned Coast will be active partners in determining where the surveys are conducted, what questions the surveys are designed to answer, and how the results are interpreted and communicated. This is not standard archaeological practice. It is a development beyond standard practice, informed by the specific context of Australian Indigenous heritage research, and by the growing understanding in the broader scientific community that Indigenous knowledge systems contain real information about the physical world that cannot be obtained by any other means. The recognition of that fact is itself a significant development in the history of Western science. For most of the history of Western science, Indigenous knowledge was treated as mythology, as cultural expression, as anything other than a reliable source of information about the world. The evidence that has accumulated, particularly in the past 2 decades, showing that specific Indigenous traditions preserve specific accurate information about geological events, ecological processes, and geographical features over timescales far longer than Western scientists previously thought possible, has forced a revision of that dismissive attitude. The revision is not complete. There are still researchers and there are still journals and there are still funding bodies that treat indigenous knowledge as inherently less reliable than the products of the Western scientific method. But the revision is underway, and it is being driven by evidence. The comparison between what the oral traditions say and what the geological record shows, in cases where that comparison is possible, consistently demonstrates that the traditions are more accurate than anyone previously admitted. The implications for the research on the drowned coast are direct. If the oral traditions of the Queensland coastal peoples describe specific features in specific locations in the sea, those descriptions should be taken seriously as guides to where investigation should be focused. Not as proof of what is there, but as evidence that should be integrated with the geological and sonar data in designing the investigation. That integration is already happening in the conversations between researchers and communities that are the early stages of the collaborative framework being built. The result is a set of research priorities that are shaped by the convergence of the traditional knowledge and the geological data, identifying the areas where both lines of evidence point towards something worth investigating. Those priority areas are real, they are specific, and they have not yet been investigated with the resolution and the methods needed to produce definitive results. The reasons they have not been investigated yet are the institutional and resource barriers that have been discussed throughout this story. Those barriers are real, they are not trivial, they require significant effort to overcome, and that effort is ongoing. But the barriers are not permanent. They are the normal friction of doing new kinds of research in institutional contexts that were built for old kinds of research. That friction can be overcome, and it is being overcome slowly in the collaborative work that is building the research program that will eventually investigate the priority areas. The timescale of that work is frustrating but not indefinite. The resources needed, while not trivial, are within the range of what the Australian research system can mobilize when it is motivated to do so. The motivation is building, driven by the combination of increasing scientific understanding of what is at stake, increasing community interest in the question, and increasing public awareness of the significance of Aboriginal cultural heritage in the marine environment. The convergence of those motivating factors will eventually produce the sustained, systematic investigation that the question requires. When that investigation happens, it will be designed right, it will be conducted right, and it will produce results that are defensible, significant, and transformative. The Great Barrier Reef will still be the Great Barrier Reef after those results are published. The coral will still be there, or what remains of it after the ongoing impacts of climate change. The fish will still be there, the turtles, the manta rays, the extraordinary biological diversity that makes the reef one of the most visited and most documented natural environments on Earth. But the story of the reef will be bigger. It will include the inner shelf, the drowned coast, the places where people lived and built and managed the landscape for tens of thousands of years before the sea covered it. It will include the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians who are still here, who still maintain connection to those waters, who have been keeping the memory of what is under them alive for 10 millennia. The story will be bigger, and that is always in the end the direction that good science moves. Toward the larger story, toward the more complete picture, toward the understanding that what we knew before was accurate but insufficient, that the truth is larger than the version of it we were working with, that the world is more complex and more interesting than we had measured. The drowned coast of the Great Barrier Reef is one of the places where that larger truth is waiting. It is waiting in the sediment, in the hard substrate, in the preserved remnants of what was built there. And it is waiting in the traditions of the people who have been keeping it alive since before the sea rose. Both are waiting for the same thing, for the research that will bring them together, for the investigation that will take the oral traditions and the sonar data and the core samples and the direct observation and synthesize them into something that the world can understand and cannot dismiss. For the moment when the oldest chapter of the Australian story emerges from the water into the light, that moment will come. The researchers know it, the communities know it, and somewhere on the sea floor of the inner shelf, under 10,000 years of water and coral and sediment, the evidence waits, patient, as the sea is patient, as the truth is patient, as all the things that have been waiting to be known are always patient with the slowness of the knowing. They wait, as they have always waited, for the ones who come looking. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only comes from being in a place for a very long time. not visiting it, not studying it from the outside, from instruments and databases and published reports, being in it, living in it, raising children in it, burying the dead in it, watching its moods across decades and generations until you know it, the way you know a member of your family, not through description, but through accumulated direct experience that goes beyond what any description can capture. The Aboriginal peoples of the Queensland coast have that kind of knowledge about the sea that borders their country. The reef, the islands, the tidal channels, the submerged terrain, they are known in the way that only long relationship produces knowing. Known not just geographically, but ecologically, seasonally, historically, spiritually. Known as a living system that changes and cycles and has memory of its own. That knowledge is not fully translatable into the categories of Western science. Much of it is encoded in the specific relationships between geographical features and the beings, human and other than human, that have relationship with those features. It is embedded in the protocols that govern who can know what about a place, who can speak about it, in what context, with what responsibilities. It is expressed in forms, story, song, ceremony that do not map directly onto the report format or the peer-reviewed paper, but some of it is translatable, some of it is geographical, specific, locatable in the coordinate systems that the sonar surveys use. Some of it is historical in the sense of containing information about what was there in the past that can be correlated with what the geological record shows. And some of it is, quite specifically, about structures, about things that were made, about places where the ancestors did not just live in the landscape, but modified it, shaped it, built things in it that were meant to last. That translatable portion of the traditional knowledge is the part that has been the focus of the collaborative work between researchers and communities. It is being handled carefully because the protocols around knowledge sharing require care and because the communities have good historical reasons to be cautious about sharing traditional knowledge with outsiders who might use it in ways that do not serve the community's interests. The legacy of extractive research in Aboriginal communities, research that takes knowledge and gives nothing back, or worse, that takes knowledge and uses it in ways that harm the communities, is a real and present concern in these conversations. The research partnerships being built are designed to address those concerns, not just through formal data sharing agreements, though those exist, through the much more difficult and important work of building genuine relationships of trust, in which the communities believe that the research is being done for them as well as by them, that the benefits of the knowledge produced will flow to them as well as to the academic institutions that employ the researchers. Building that trust takes time. It requires showing up consistently. It requires following through on commitments. It requires being willing to be guided by the communities on questions of protocol and priority. It requires accepting that the research will proceed at the pace that the relationship allows, not the pace that the academic publishing schedule demands. Researchers who have done this work describe it as the most demanding and the most rewarding research experience they have had. More demanding than any fieldwork, more rewarding than any publication. Because what is being built is not just knowledge in the conventional sense, but a new kind of relationship between different knowledge systems. A relationship in which both have something to offer and both have something to learn. That new relationship, when it produces results, will produce something that neither system could have produced alone. The sonar data without the oral tradition is anomalies in a large area of interest. The oral tradition without the sonar data is geographically suggestive but physically unconfirmed. Together, they become a research program focused on specific locations with specific questions and a reasonable expectation of finding specific kinds of evidence. The convergence of the two makes the research more efficient, more likely to succeed, and more meaningful when it does. It is the convergence that is the innovation, not the technology, not the traditional knowledge by itself. The bringing together of the two in a relationship of mutual respect and shared purpose is what will produce the discovery. That is the model that this research, at its best, represents. A model for how the most important questions in the archaeology and cultural heritage of the deep past can be pursued when the communities whose heritage is at stake are recognized as the experts they are. The expertise of Aboriginal Australians in the history of their country is not complementary to the expertise of the researchers. It is not supplementary. It is, in many cases, primary. The researchers bring techniques and analytical tools that the communities do not have independent access to. The communities bring knowledge that the researchers cannot obtain by any other means. Neither is complete without the other. This is not a statement of ideological principle, though it is consistent with principles that are increasingly widely held in the field of indigenous research ethics. It is a practical statement about the research problem. The research problem cannot be solved without both kinds of knowledge. That is simply a fact about what is known and not known from each perspective. The collaborative research framework being built to investigate the drowned coast of the Great Barrier Reef is therefore not a political concession. It is the right research design. It is the design most likely to produce results. It is the design that the nature of the question and the nature of the available evidence demands. And when it produces those results, the form in which they are published, the way the knowledge is attributed and credited, the way the benefits are distributed, will reflect the collaborative nature of the work. The traditional owners will not be thanked in an acknowledgement section. They will be partners in the research, co-investigators in the formal sense, authors on the publications, owners of the intellectual product that emerges from the synthesis of their traditional knowledge and the scientific data. This is different from how most Australian archaeology has been done. It is the way that Australian archaeology needs to be done and is increasingly being done, in the context of a society that is slowly coming to terms with the depth and the significance of Aboriginal cultural heritage and the right of Aboriginal communities to be the primary custodians and interpreters of that heritage. The drowned coast of the inner shelf is part of that heritage. It is among the oldest and most significant parts of it, and when it is investigated, it will be investigated in a way that honors that significance. The outcome of the investigation, whatever it is, will belong first to the communities whose ancestors created what is found. It will belong to the scientific record second, and it will belong to the public understanding of human history third. All three kinds of belonging are important. None supersedes the others. They are different dimensions of the significance of what is at stake. For the communities, the significance is the recovery of the physical evidence of what the oral traditions have been describing, the confirmation that the memory is accurate, that the ancestors really were there, that what they built really existed, that the sea really did cover it, and that the knowledge of it was preserved across 10,000 years of water. The emotional and cultural weight of that confirmation will be, for the communities, very large. It is the kind of thing that is difficult to articulate in the language of academic papers and press releases, but that is, at the level of lived experience, profound. For the scientific record, the significance is the addition of a new category of archaeological evidence to the known inventory of human cultural achievement, the oldest confirmed human constructions, from the oldest continuously occupied continent, built by the culture with the deepest documented history. The significance for the understanding of human prehistory is, as has been discussed throughout this story, enormous. For the public understanding of human history, the significance is the revision of a story that has been truncated, simplified, and in some fundamental ways distorted by the limits of the evidence previously available. The story of human culture does not begin 5,000 years ago in Egypt and Mesopotamia. It does not begin with agriculture. It does not begin, in the Australian context, with European contact. It begins much, much earlier, and the physical evidence of that early beginning, when it is found and confirmed, will make that truth available in a form that is very hard to argue with. A structure on the seafloor, carbon dated, confirmed as human in origin, older than any other known human construction by a margin of thousands of years. That is evidence that changes the conversation, not just for specialists, for everyone. The conversation that changes will not just be about Australia. It will be about what human beings are and have been and are capable of. It will be about the length and the depth of the human story. It will be about the relationship between culture and nature, between intelligence and environment, between what people can build and what they choose to build when they have time and resources and knowledge, and the kind of deep connection to a place that comes from living in it for 10,000 years. It will be about the Great Barrier Reef, finally, as what it actually is. Not just a natural wonder threatened by climate change and human carelessness, but a natural wonder that is also a human heritage site of the deepest possible significance. A place where the story of the living reef and the story of the human relationship with that reef are one story, told in two different media, the carbonate skeleton of the coral and the oral traditions of the coastal peoples, reaching back to the same beginning. That beginning is what the research is trying to recover. The beginning of the relationship between the people of this coast and the waters that are now the home of the reef. the beginning that the sea covered and that the oral traditions preserved, and that the science is slowly reaching toward. It is close, not today, but closer than it has ever been. The tools are better, the relationships are forming, the data is accumulating, the will is building. The drowned coast of the Great Barrier Reef has been waiting for 10,000 years. It will not have to wait much longer, and when the wait is over, when the evidence comes out of the water into the light, when the oldest chapter of the human story on this continent is finally, physically, actually visible, the story that will be told will be one of the great stories. Not because it is dramatic, though it is dramatic. Not because it is surprising, though it will surprise the mainstream. But because it is true. Because it is the real story of real people who really lived in a real place that is now under the sea. Because it is the story that the oral traditions have been keeping alive for 10,000 years, waiting for the moment when the science could confirm what the traditions had always known. That moment is coming. It is coming because people are working toward it. Researchers and community members and knowledge holders and advocates, and everyone who has ever been curious about the deep human story and unwilling to accept that the story is as short and as simple as the standard account suggests. It is coming because the evidence is there, because the seafloor holds what the sea covered, because the water does not destroy. It preserves, it changes in the way that 10,000 years of immersion changes things. But it preserves the shape, the outline, the geometry, the specific fact of what was there, waiting to be found. The Great Barrier Reef, the greatest natural wonder in the world, and beneath it, in the drowned coastal plain of the oldest inhabited continent, the greatest cultural wonder we have not yet found. They share the same water. They have shared it for 10,000 years, and the story of both, when it is finally fully told, will be one of the most remarkable stories in the history of the species that built there, remembered it, and is now slowly going back to find it. Thank you for staying with this story. If it kept you here through the night or through the long afternoon or through whatever time you have been in, then it did what it was meant to do. These are the stories that matter, not because they are solved, because they are real, because the questions are real, because the people who are working toward the answers are real, and the communities whose heritage is at stake are real, and the evidence on the seafloor waiting to be found is real. Stay curious. The ocean has more in it than we know. The history of science is, in significant part, the history of looking in the wrong place. Or rather, the history of looking in only some of the right places while missing others entirely. The wrong places are not usually wrong because the researchers who looked there were incompetent. They are wrong because the available tools, the available frameworks, the available conceptual equipment pointed there. Because what was knowable with the tools in hand directed attention to certain places and away from others. The seafloor is one of the great systematic blind spots of 20th century archaeology. Not because anyone decided not to look there, because the tools needed to look there did not exist or were not affordable, or were not in the hands of people with the right questions to ask. The maritime archaeology that has produced the extraordinary results from Doggerland and the Mediterranean and the Gulf of Mexico is a young field. It has been building its toolkit and its conceptual framework since the 1980s, and it is still growing. The application of that toolkit to the specific question of submerged prehistoric sites in Australia is newer still, but the field is growing. The tools are available, and the questions are finally being asked by people with the training and the relationships to ask them productively. The blind spot is closing. The understanding of the drowned coast of the Great Barrier Reef is moving from the periphery of Australian archaeology toward its centre, not quickly, not smoothly, but in the direction that the evidence demands, which is the direction of taking it seriously, investigating it properly, and being willing to revise fundamental assumptions when the results require it. Fundamental assumptions are being revised already, without the physical confirmation of structures on the inner shelf. The assumption that Aboriginal Australians were purely nomadic foragers with no significant relationship to fixed landscape features has been revised by Budge Bim and Brewerina and the growing body of evidence for large-scale landscape management. The assumption that oral traditions cannot preserve accurate geographical information over millennial timescales has been revised by the work of Nunn, Reed, and others. The assumption that the most significant prehistoric archaeological sites are on the current land surface has been challenged by the growing body of maritime archaeology globally, and by the specific evidence for Aboriginal presence in the marine environment. Each of these revisions creates space for the next one. when the assumption that the drowned coast is archaeologically significant is revised from a fringe position to a mainstream one, the research will follow, the funding will follow, the systematic investigation will follow. The revision of that assumption is already happening in the research community. It is taking longer to happen in the funding bodies and the public understanding, but it is happening. Every paper published on the subject, every documentary made about it, every public lecture given by the researchers working on it, every conversation between those researchers and the communities whose traditions speak to it moves the revision forward. The threshold that needs to be crossed is the threshold from interesting hypothesis to confirmed finding. That crossing requires physical evidence. The kind of evidence that can be photographed, sampled, dated, described in precise enough terms that the mainstream cannot avoid engaging with it. That evidence is on the seafloor. It will be found. When it is found, it will cross the threshold. And what the crossing of that threshold will produce is a new understanding, not just of Australia's past, but of the full depth and character of the human story on this planet. A story that is longer, richer, more complex, and more continuous than the version we have been working with. A story that has room in it for the people who built fish traps in the estuaries of drowned rivers 10,000 years ago, and whose descendants still know, in their traditions, that something was there. A story that begins not with writing, not with agriculture, not with cities, but with people living in and managing and building in the landscape that was available to them, with people sophisticated enough, organized enough, invested enough in their place to leave a physical record that persists across 10,000 years of ocean. The Great Barrier Reef is the surface of that story. The drowned coast beneath it is the depth. Both are extraordinary. Together they are something even more remarkable than either alone. And the story of both is still being written by the researchers doing the surveys, by the community members sharing the traditions, by the ocean itself, which is both the medium that conceals what is there and the medium through which it will eventually be found. The ocean is patient, the truth is patient, the evidence is patient, and the story, when it is finally fully told, will be worth the patience it required. The water holds it, the traditions remember it, the research is reaching toward it, and somewhere out there, in the blue water of the Coral Sea, above the drowned coast of the oldest inhabited continent, the surface catches the light and does not reveal what is below. But below is where the story is. Below is where it has always been, waiting for the moment when the world is ready to receive it. That moment is almost here. Come back when it arrives. The reef will still be there. The traditions will still be there. The researchers will have gotten closer. The communities will have shared more. The evidence will have accumulated further toward the point of certainty. And one day, the story will be told not as a question, but as a discovery. Not as what might be down there, but as what was found. Not as the hypothesis of what the oldest chapter of the Australian story looks like, but as the chapter itself, recovered from the water, confirmed by the science, celebrated by the communities whose ancestors wrote it. That day is coming. Until then, the ocean keeps its secret. Patient as it always has been. Patient as the stone that was placed and the water that covered it. Patient as the memory that was kept. Patient as the truth that waits. Consider for a moment what it means to be among the last people on Earth who know where something is. Not the only person, but one of a small group whose traditions have carried a specific geographical memory across a span of time longer than recorded history anywhere on the planet. A memory of a place, of what was in it, of what made it significant. The Aboriginal Australians whose traditions speak of the drowned coast are in that position. They are the custodians of geographical and historical knowledge that no other living human community possesses. Knowledge about a landscape that no living person has seen above the waterline. Knowledge that has been transmitted carefully and with deliberate attention across approximately 400 generations of human beings. 400 generations. That is the number of transmission events between the last person who saw that landscape as dry land and the people alive today who carry, in their oral traditions, the memory of it. Each of those 400 generations had to receive the tradition accurately enough to pass it on recognizably. Each had to care enough about the tradition to maintain it. Each had to understand its significance well enough to protect it. The fact that the tradition survives, in a form specific enough to guide modern research to the correct locations on the seafloor, is itself a remarkable achievement, more remarkable in some ways than the structures the tradition describes. Because a stone wall can sit on a seafloor and persist through physical inertia, through the absence of any force strong enough to destroy it. But a tradition persists only through active maintenance, only through the sustained attention of people who choose, generation after generation, to remember and to pass on what they remember. The choice to remember is not passive, it is an act, an ongoing act of cultural commitment that has been performed, in the case of these specific traditions, for longer than any other kind of cultural institution in human history has persisted. The pyramids of Egypt have stood for 4,500 years. The oral traditions of the Queensland coastal peoples have preserved specific geographical information for more than twice as long. That comparison is not meant to diminish the achievements of the pyramid builders. It is meant to properly recognize the achievement of the tradition keepers, an achievement that has not been recognized because the kind of knowledge it preserves was not, until very recently, accepted as evidence by the institutions that control what counts as knowledge. That is changing. And as it changes, the traditions are moving from the category of cultural interest to the category of research resource, not losing their cultural significance in the process, gaining additional significance as sources of information that can contribute to the physical discovery of what they describe. The transition from cultural interest to research resource has to be managed carefully. The communities that hold these traditions have legitimate concerns about how that transition happens, about who controls the knowledge once it enters the research stream, about who benefits from the discoveries it leads to, about whether the protocols that govern the transmission and use of the knowledge within the community are respected in the way it is handled outside the community. These concerns are being addressed, imperfectly but genuinely, in the collaborative frameworks being built around this research. The frameworks acknowledge that the traditional knowledge is not a free resource to be extracted and used without accountability. It belongs to the communities in a way that is not simply metaphorical. It is part of their cultural estate, governed by their law, and any use of it that does not respect that governance is a form of the same extraction that has characterized colonial relationships with Aboriginal knowledge for 200 years. The research that is going to find what is on the inner shelf will not be that kind of extraction. It will be the other kind of research, the kind that treats the knowledge as belonging to the people who hold it and structures itself around that belonging. It will produce results that belong to those people as much as they belong to the scientific record. And those results, when they come, will vindicate the 400 generations of tradition keepers who kept the knowledge alive, who chose, generation after generation, to remember and to pass it on, who maintained, across the longest span of continuous cultural transmission in human history, the memory of a place that has been under the sea for 10,000 years. The vindication will not be primarily for the living generation of knowledge holders, who have never needed the science to validate what they know. They know it because their grandparents knew it, and their grandparents' grandparents before them, in a chain that goes back to the people who were there. The vindication will be for the understanding of the outside world, for the institutions and the funding bodies and the peer-reviewed journals and the public discourse that has not, until now, taken seriously what the traditions describe. That understanding, once revised, will not need to be revised again in the same direction. You do not, once you have confirmed that oral traditions can preserve accurate geographical information across 10,000 years, go back to dismissing oral traditions as mythology. The revision is permanent. The framework for how traditional knowledge is understood in relation to the physical evidence of the past is change for good. That change is already happening in the work of Nunn and Reed and others who have documented the accuracy of specific Aboriginal oral traditions in relation to specific geological events. The investigation of the drowned coast of the Great Barrier Reef, when it produces confirmed physical evidence correlating with what the traditions describe, will extend and deepen that change. The change in understanding will be one of the lasting contributions of this research, regardless of what exactly is found on the seafloor. Even if what is found is less dramatic than some of the more optimistic predictions, even if the structures are smaller or less well preserved than hoped, the confirmation of the principle that oral traditions can guide physical research to specific locations and produce recoverable results will be a permanent addition to the methodology of prehistoric research globally. That contribution is not small. It opens the door for similar research in other parts of the world, where indigenous oral traditions speak of drowned landscapes, for investigations of the submerged shelves of Southeast Asia, where the traditions of communities living on the coasts of Indonesia and Malaysia and the Philippines speak of land that is now sea, for investigations of the Pacific Islands, where traditions of lands to the east and west and north describe landscapes that were above water during the glacial maximum and are now under the ocean, for investigations of the Americas, where the oral traditions of coastal indigenous peoples describe coastlines that no longer exist. The methodology, once established and validated in the Australian context, becomes globally applicable. The Great Barrier Reef investigation, in other words, is not just about the Great Barrier Reef. It is about developing and demonstrating a research approach that will transform the archaeology of drowned landscapes worldwide. That is the larger significance of the work being done here. Larger than the specific discoveries that will be made, larger than the revision to the Australian archaeological record, larger even than the vindication of 400 generations of tradition keepers. It is a contribution to the methodology of science, to the way science incorporates knowledge from different cultural traditions into its practice, to the way science relates to the communities whose heritage is at stake in the research it conducts. Science that learns from this experience will be better science, more accurate in its methods, more complete in its evidence base, more respectful in its relationships with the communities whose knowledge it draws on, more likely to produce the right results in the right way. The Great Barrier Reef is teaching us something, not just about what is on its seafloor, about how to look, about who to work with in the looking, about what counts as evidence and where evidence can come from, about the relationship between the newest technology and the oldest knowledge, and what becomes possible when they are combined in the right way. The lesson is one that science needed to learn, that archaeology needed to learn, that the broader project of human self-understanding needed to learn. It is learning it now. In the water off the coast of Queensland, in the conversations between researchers and tradition holders, in the sonar data and the sediment cores and the oral traditions, and the years of patient work that are building towards something larger than any of its components. The Great Barrier Reef, the drowned coast beneath it, the oldest human story on the oldest inhabited continent, and the research finally beginning to read it. The last thing to say before the story closes and the water closes over it is this. The people who will make the discovery when it comes are not yet known. They may be researchers who are currently working in marine geology or maritime archaeology, and who will find their way to this specific question through the normal channels of scientific inquiry. They may be younger researchers who are now in graduate school, working on the methodological and theoretical tools that will make the investigation possible. They may be Aboriginal community members who become involved in the research and who contribute knowledge, perspective, and relationship that no outside researcher could bring to the work. Most likely the discovery, when it comes, will be the product of many people over many years, each contributing a piece of the work. The researcher who processes the sonar data that flags the first clear anomaly. The community member who points toward the location where the tradition says something should be found. The diver who descends to the site and reports what they see. The analyst who runs the radiocarbon dates on the recovered material. The team that synthesizes all of it into a coherent published account. All of them will be part of the discovery. None will make it alone. That is how the most significant scientific discoveries actually happen. Not in the singular moment of an individual genius perceiving what no one else has seen, but in the accumulated work of many people, each contributing from their own expertise and perspective, building toward a result that none of them could have reached independently. The discovery of what lies beneath the Great Barrier Reef will be that kind of discovery, a product of collaboration, of patience, of the convergence of different kinds of knowledge toward the point where the evidence becomes undeniable. And when it is made, it will be shared, not held by the researchers who made it, not controlled by the institutions that funded it, shared in the appropriate ways with the communities whose heritage it confirms, with the scientific community that will build on it, and with the broader public that wants to understand where the human story goes and how deep it really runs. The sharing is part of the science. It is not a public relations exercise. It is the completion of the research process. Knowledge that is not shared is not fully realized. The significance of a discovery is not in the discovery itself, but in the understanding it produces, and the ways that understanding changes how people think about themselves and their world. The understanding that will come from this discovery will change how people think about Australia, about Aboriginal Australians, about the relationship between the oldest human culture and the natural wonders of the continent it has inhabited for 65,000 years, about what human beings have been doing on this earth for longer than the standard account acknowledges. That change in understanding is the point, not the ruins on the seafloor, not the specific radiocarbon dates, not the peer-reviewed publications. The change in understanding is the point, and the change in understanding will be real and will matter and will last. The water keeps the secret for now. The research is building toward the moment of revealing. The traditions are holding the memory. The communities are maintaining the connection. The researchers are developing the tools and the relationships. The evidence is accumulating in the sonar data and the geological record and the oral archive of the coastline peoples. And somewhere on the inner shelf of the Great Barrier Reef, the oldest human construction on Earth may be waiting to be found. Patient as the stone it was made from. Patient as the water that covers it. Patient as the truth always is, when it knows that eventually someone will come looking, someone is coming. They are closer than they have ever been, and the reef is patient, and the water is patient, and the story is patient, and the world, when it is ready, will find what has been waiting for it. Down there, in the water, in the oldest country in the world. There is no summary adequate to the depth of what this story contains. Not because the story is too complex to summarize, though it is complex, but because the nature of what is at stake, the length of the human record on this continent, the specificity of the oral traditions that have preserved memory of a drowned landscape, the character of the geological anomalies on the inner shelf, and the collaborative research that is slowly converging on the answers to the questions all of this raises. These things do not compress into a summary without losing the texture that makes them significant. The texture is the story. The way the sonar data and the oral traditions and the aquaculture systems of Budge Bim and the fish traps of Brew Arena and the genetic record of Aboriginal occupation and the geological history of the Holocene transgression all fit together into a single picture. A picture of what the drowned coast of Australia really is and what it might contain. That texture is what needs to be held in mind when thinking about why this research matters. It matters because the human story on this continent is the longest, the most continuous, and in many ways the most sophisticated story of human adaptation to a specific environment in the entire record of our species. It matters because the coastal plain that is now under the reef was the setting of a significant portion of that story, inhabited for tens of thousands of years by people whose cultural achievements we are only beginning to understand. It matters because the physical evidence of those achievements may be recoverable if the research is done. And it matters because recovering that evidence will change the story we tell about Australia, about Aboriginal culture, and about what human beings have been doing on this earth for far longer than we previously acknowledged. That changed story is worth pursuing, worth the years of patient collaborative work, worth the resources needed to do the research properly, worth the disruption to established assumptions that the discovery will cause. The disruption is the point. The assumptions that need to be disrupted are ones that have done harm and continue to do harm by undervaluing and misrepresenting the depth and the sophistication of Aboriginal Australian culture. The physical evidence of what was built on the drowned coast will disrupt those assumptions in a way that no argument, however carefully reasoned, can do. Because the evidence will be physical. It will be there, it will be old, it will be undeniable. And it will be the product of the people whose descendants are still here, still connected to the water that covers it, still maintaining the traditions that describe it. That is the story. That is why it matters. And that is what is waiting in the water beneath the reef for the research that will finally bring it into the light. The ocean is patient, the knowledge is patient, the discovery is coming. One last thing, the reef itself is changing. The bleaching events of recent decades, driven by warming oceans, have altered the living system in ways that are well documented and deeply alarming. The crisis of the living reef is real and urgent and deserves the attention it receives. But the crisis of the drowned reef, the loss of the evidence on the inner shelf through ongoing disturbance, and the gradual effects of changing ocean chemistry, is a parallel crisis that receives almost no attention at all. The research that is needed to understand and protect the archaeological heritage of the inner shelf is research that needs to happen now, not in the indefinite future when conditions are somehow more favorable.